Hallo, liebe Entdecker, bevor wir uns in die nächsten aufregenden Kapitel von Die verlorene Welt stürzen, fassen wir kurz zusammen. Edward Malone hat sich, um das Herz seiner Geliebten zurückzugewinnen, einem riskanten Plan angeschlossen. Er will Professor Challengers Behauptung einer lebendigen, prähistorischen Welt beweisen. In den Kapiteln 6 bis 10 erreichen die Abenteurer endlich ihr Ziel. Doch was sie dort erwartet, übertrifft jede Vorstellungskraft. Seid gespannt. Kapitel 6. Ich war die Geißel des Herrn. Lord John Roxton und ich bogen gemeinsam in die Vigo Street ein und schritten durch die schmutzigen Portale der berühmten aristokratischen Einöde. Am Ende eines langen, tristen Ganges stieß mein neuer Bekannter eine Tür auf und betätigte einen elektrischen Schalter. Eine Reihe von Lampen, die durch getönte Schirme schienen, tauchte den ganzen großen Raum vor uns in einen rötlichen Glanz. Als ich in der Tür stand und mich umsah, hatte ich den allgemeinen Eindruck von außerordentlichem Komfort und Eleganz, kombiniert mit einer Atmosphäre männlicher Virilität. Überall vermischten sich der Luxus des wohlhabenden Mannes mit Geschmack und die sorglose Unordnung des Junggesellen. Wertvolle Pelze und seltsame schillernde Matten von einem orientalischen Basar waren auf dem Boden verstreut. Bilder und Drucke, die selbst meine ungeübten Augen als von großem Wert und Seltenheit erkennen konnten, hingen dicht an den Wänden, Skizzen von Boxern. Ballettmädchen und Rennpferden wechselten sich ab mit einem sinnlichen Fragonard, einem kriegerischen Girardet und einem verträumten Turner. Doch inmitten dieser vielfältigen Ornamente waren die Trophäen verstreut, die meine Erinnerung an die Tatsache, dass Lord John Roxton einer der großen Allround-Sportler und Athleten seiner Zeit war, stark zurückbrachten. Ein dunkelblaues Ruder, das mit einem Kirschrosa gekreuzt über seinem Kaminsims lag, sprach vom alten Oxonie und Leandermann, während die Fechtklingen und Boxhandschuhe darüber und darunter die Werkzeuge eines Mannes waren, der mit jedem von ihnen die Vormachtstellung errungen hatte. Wie ein Fries um den Raum war die vorspringende Reihe prächtiger, schwerer Wildköpfe, die besten ihrer Art aus allen Teilen der Welt, mit dem seltenen weißen Nashorn der Lado-Enklave, das seine hochmütige Lippe über sie alle hängen ließ. In der Mitte des reichen roten Teppichs stand ein schwarz-goldener Louis-XV-Tisch. Eine wunderschöne Antiquität, die nun frevelhaft mit Glasflecken und den Narben von Zigarrenstummeln entweiht war. Darauf stand ein silbernes Tablett mit Rauchwaren und ein polierter Spirituosenständer, von dem und einem angrenzenden Siphon mein schweigender Gastgeber 2 hohe Gläser füllte. Nachdem er mir einen Sessel gezeigt und mein Erfrischungsgetränk in der Nähe platziert hatte, reichte er mir eine lange, glatte Havanna. Dann setzte er sich mir gegenüber, sah mich lange und aufmerksam mit seinen seltsamen, funkelnden, waghalsigen Augen an, Augen von einem kalten Hellblau, der Farbe eines Gletschersees. Durch den dünnen Dunst meines Zigarrenrauchs bemerkte ich die Details eines Gesichts, das mir bereits von vielen Fotografien vertraut war. Die stark gekrümmte Nase, die hohlen, verwitterten Wangen, das dunkle, rötliche Haar, das oben dünn war, der gestochen scharfe, virile Schnurrbart, der kleine, aggressive Haarbüschel auf seinem vorstehenden Kinn. Etwas von Napoleon de Rede, Etwas von Don Quixote und doch wieder etwas, das die Essenz des englischen Landedelmannes war, des scharfsinnigen, aufmerksamen, im Freien lebenden Liebhabers von Hunden und Pferden. Seine Haut war von einem satten Blumentopfroten von Sonne und Wind. Seine Augenbrauen waren buschig und überhängend, was diesen von Natur aus kalten Augen einen fast grimmigen Aspekt verlieh. Ein Eindruck, der durch seine starke und gefurchte Stirn noch verstärkt wurde. In seiner Gestalt war er schlank, aber sehr kräftig gebaut. In der Tat hatte er oft bewiesen, dass es nur wenige Männer in England gab, die zu solch anhaltenden Anstrengungen fähig waren. Seine Größe betrug etwas über 6 Fuß. Aber er schien aufgrund einer eigentümlichen Rundung der Schultern kleiner. So war der berühmte Lord John Roxton, als er mir gegenüber saß, fest auf seine Zigarre biss und mich in einem langen und peinlichen Schweigen stetig beobachtete. »Nun«, sagte er schließlich, »wir haben es getan, junger Bursche, mein Junge.« Diesen merkwürdigen Satz sprach er aus, bitte, als wäre es ein einziges Wort, »junger Bursche, mein Junge«. Ja, wir haben einen Sprung gewagt, du und ich. Ich nehme an, als du in diesen Raum gingst, hattest du keine solche Vorstellung im Kopf. Was? Kein Gedanke daran. Dasselbe hier. Kein Gedanke daran, Dusti. Und hier sind wir. Bis zum Hals in der Terrine. Ich bin erst seit 3 Wochen aus Uganda zurück und habe einen Platz in Schottland eingenommen und den Mietvertrag und alles unterschrieben. Ziemlich losgegangen. Was? Wie trifft dich das? Nun, es liegt alles in der Hauptlinie meines Geschäfts. Ich bin Journalist bei der Gazette. Natürlich. Du hast es gesagt, als du es übernommen hast. Übrigens, ich habe einen kleinen Job für dich, wenn du mir hilfst. Gerne. Macht es dir nichts aus, ein Risiko einzugehen, oder? Was ist das Risiko? Nun, es ist Ballinger, er ist das Risiko. Hast du von ihm gehört? Nein. Warum, junger Bursche? Wo hast du gelebt? Sir John Ballinger ist der beste Gentleman-Jockey in der nördlichen Grafschaft. Ich konnte ihn im Flachen bei meinem Besten halten, aber über Hindernisse ist er mein Meister. Nun, es ist ein offenes Geheimnis, dass er, wenn er nicht im Training ist, hart trinkt, einen Durchschnitt bildet, wie er es nennt. Er bekam am Dienstag Delirium und tobt seitdem wie ein Teufel. Sein Zimmer ist über diesem, die Ärzte sagen, dass es mit dem alten Schatz vorbei ist, wenn er nicht etwas zu essen bekommt. Aber da er mit einem Revolver auf seiner Bettdecke im Bett liegt und schwört, dass er 6 der Besten durch jeden schießen wird, der in seine Nähe kommt, gab es einen kleinen Streik unter den Bediensteten. Er ist ein harter Kerl, dieser Jack, und auch ein guter Schütze. Aber man kann einen Grand National-Gewinner nicht so sterben lassen. Was? Was hast du dann vor? Fragte ich. Nun, meine Idee war, dass du und ich ihn überfallen könnten. Er döst vielleicht, und im schlimmsten Fall kann er nur einen von uns an der Schulter verletzen, und der andere sollte ihn haben. Wenn wir seinen Kissenbezug um seine Arme bekommen und dann eine Magensonde anrufen können, werden wir dem alten Schatz das Abendessen seines Lebens geben. Es war eine ziemlich verzweifelte Sache, die plötzlich in den Arbeitsalltag hereinbrach. Ich glaube nicht, dass ich ein besonders mutiger Mann bin. Ich habe eine irische Vorstellungskraft, die das Unbekannte und Unversuchte schrecklicher macht, als sie sind. Auf der anderen Seite wurde ich mit einem Horror vor Feigheit und einer Angst vor einem solchen Stigma umzogen. Ich wage zu behaupten, dass ich mich über eine Klippe werfen könnte, wie der Hunne in den Geschichtsbüchern, wenn mein Mut dazu in Frage gestellt würde. Und doch wären es sicherlich Stolz und Angst, eher als Mut, die meine Inspiration wären. Obwohl sich also jede Nervenfaser in meinem Körper vor der whisky-verrückten Gestalt zurückzog, die ich mir im Zimmer darüber vorstellte, antwortete ich dennoch, mit einer so sorglosen Stimme, wie ich sie befehligen konnte, dass ich bereit sei zu gehen. Eine weitere Bemerkung von Lord Roxton über die Gefahr machte mich nur reizbar. »Reden wird es nicht besser machen«, sagte ich. »Komm schon.« Ich erhob mich von meinem Stuhl und er von seinem. Dann, mit einem kleinen vertraulichen Kichern, klopfte er mir 2- oder 3-mal auf die Brust und schob mich schließlich zurück in meinen Stuhl. »In Ordnung, Sohnemann, mein Junge, du wirst es tun«, sagte er. Ich sah überrascht auf. »Ich habe mich heute Morgen selbst um Jack Ballinger gekümmert. Er hat ein Loch in den Rock meines Kimonos geblasen. Segne seine zittrige alte Hand, aber wir haben ihm eine Jacke angezogen und er wird in einer Woche wieder in Ordnung sein. Ich sage, junger Bursche, ich hoffe, es macht dir nichts aus. Was? Siehst du, unter uns gesagt, ich betrachte dieses Südamerika-Geschäft als eine sehr ernste Sache, und wenn ich einen Kumpel bei mir habe, möchte ich einen Mann, auf den ich mich verlassen kann. Also habe ich dich gemessen, und ich muss sagen, du hast dich gut geschlagen. Du siehst, es liegt alles an dir und mir, denn dieser alte Summerlee-Mann wird von Anfang an eine Trockenpflege brauchen. Übrigens, bist du zufällig der Malone, von dem erwartet wird, dass er seine Rugby-Kappe für Irland bekommt? Vielleicht eine Reserve? Ich dachte, ich erinnere mich an dein Gesicht. Ich war dort, als du diesen Versuch gegen Richmond gemacht hast. Oh, so ein feiner Schwenklauf, wie ich ihn die ganze Saison gesehen habe. Ich verpasse nie ein Rugby-Match, wenn ich es vermeiden kann, denn es ist das männlichste Spiel, das wir noch haben. Nun, ich habe dich nicht nur zum Sportreden hierher eingeladen. Wir müssen unser Geschäft regeln. Hier sind die Abfahrten. Auf der ersten Seite der Times. Es gibt ein Boot der Booth-Linie für Para nächsten Mittwoch in einer Woche. Und wenn der Professor und du es einrichten könnt, denke ich, sollten wir es nehmen. Was? Sehr gut. Ich werde es mit ihm klären. Was ist mit deiner Ausrüstung? Meine Zeitung wird sich darum kümmern. Kannst du schießen? Etwa durchschnittlicher Territorialstandard. Gott im Himmel, so schlecht ist es, das ist das Letzte, woran ihr jungen Burschen denkt zu lernen. Ihr seid alle Bienen ohne Stachel, was das Aufpassen auf den Bienenstock angeht. Ihr werdet eines Tages dumm aussehen, wenn jemand kommt und den Honig stiehlt. Aber du musst deine Waffe in Südamerika ruhig halten, denn wenn unser Freund der Professor kein Verrückter oder Lügner ist, könnten wir einige seltsame Dinge sehen, bevor wir zurückkommen. Welche Waffe hast du? Er ging zu einem Eichenschrank, und als er ihn aufstieß, erhaschte ich einen Blick auf glänzende Reihen paralleler Läufe, wie die Pfeifen einer Orgel. »Ich werde sehen, was ich dir aus meiner eigenen Batterie ersparen kann«, sagte er. Eins nach dem anderen nahm er eine Reihe schöner Gewehre heraus, öffnete und schloss sie mit einem Schnappen und einem Klirren und tätschelte sie dann, als er sie wieder in den Ständer stellte, so zärtlich, wie eine Mutter ihre Kinder liebkosen würde. »Dies ist ein Blanz, .575 Axide Express«, sagte er. »Ich habe diesen großen Kerl damit erwischt.« Er blickte zu dem weißen Nashorn auf. 10 Meter mehr, und er hätte mich zu seiner Sammlung hinzugefügt. An diesem konischen Geschoss hängt seine einzige Chance. Es ist der faire Vorteil des Schwachen. Ich hoffe, du kennst deinen Gordon, denn er ist der Dichter des Pferdes und der Waffe und des Mannes, der beides handhabt. Nun, hier ist ein nützliches Werkzeug, wie um 470, Teleskopvisier, doppelter Auswerfer, auf 350 Meter punktgenau, und das ist das Gewehr, das ich vor 3 Jahren gegen die peruanischen Sklaventreiber benutzt habe. Ich war die Geißel des Herrn in diesen Gegenden, das kann ich dir sagen, obwohl du es in keinem Blaubuch finden wirst. Es gibt Zeiten, junger Bursche, in denen jeder von uns für menschliches Recht und Gerechtigkeit eintreten muss. Oder du fühlst dich nie wieder sauber. Deshalb habe ich einen kleinen Krieg auf eigene Faust geführt, ihn selbst erklärt, ihn selbst geführt, ihn selbst beendet. Jeder dieser Einschnitte ist für einen Sklavenmörder, eine gute Reihe von ihnen. Was? Der Große ist für Pedro Lopez, den König von ihnen allen, den ich in einem Altwasser des Putumayo-Flusses getötet habe. Nun, hier ist etwas, das für dich geeignet wäre. Er nahm ein schönes braun-silbernes Gewehr heraus, gut gummiert am Schaft, scharf visiert, 5 Patronen im Magazin. Du kannst dein Leben darauf vertrauen. Er reichte es mir und schloss die Tür seines Eichenschranks. Übrigens, fuhr er fort, als er zu seinem Stuhl zurückkehrte, was weißt du von diesem Professor Challenger? Ich habe ihn bis heute nie gesehen. Nun, ich auch nicht. Es ist lustig, dass wir beide unter versiegelten Befehlen von einem Mann segeln, den wir nicht kennen. Er schien ein hochnäsiger alter Vogel zu sein. Seine Brüder der Wissenschaft scheint man ihn auch nicht allzu sehr zu mögen. Wie bist du dazu gekommen, dich für die Sache zu interessieren? Ich erzählte ihm kurz meine Erlebnisse des Vormittags und er hörte aufmerksam zu. Dann zog er eine Karte von Südamerika heraus und legte sie auf den Tisch. Ich glaube, jedes einzelne Wort, das er dir gesagt hat, Dimmer, war die Wahrheit, sagte er ernsthaft. Und wohlgemerkt, ich habe etwas, worauf ich mich stützen kann, wenn ich so spreche. Südamerika ist ein Ort, den ich liebe, und ich denke, wenn du es von Darien bis Fuego nimmst, ist es das großartigste, reichste, wunderbarste Stück Erde auf diesem Planeten. Die Leute wissen es noch nicht und erkennen nicht, was es werden könnte. Ich war es von Ende zu Ende auf und ab gereist und hatte 2 Trockenzeiten in genau diesen Gegenden. Wie ich dir erzählte, als ich von dem Krieg sprach, den ich gegen die Sklavenhändler geführt habe. Nun, als ich dort oben war, hörte ich einige Geschichten derselben Art, Tradition von Indianern und Ähnlichem, aber zweifellos mit etwas dahinter. Je mehr du von diesem Land wüsstest, junger Bursche, desto mehr würdest du verstehen, dass alles möglich war. Alles. Es gibt nur einige enge Wasserwege, auf denen die Leute reisen, und außerhalb davon ist alles Dunkelheit. Nun, hier unten in der Mato Grande, er fuhr mit seiner Zigarre über einen Teil der Karte, oder hier oben in dieser Ecke, wo 3 Länder aufeinandertreffen, würde mich nichts überraschen. Wie dieser Kerl heute Abend sagte, gibt es 50.000 Meilen Wasserwege, die durch einen Wald führen, der fast die Größe Europas hat. Du und ich könnten so weit voneinander entfernt sein wie Schottland von Konstantinopel, und doch wäre jeder von uns im selben großen brasilianischen Wald. Der Mensch hat nur hier eine Spur und dort einen Kratzer in dem Labyrinth gemacht. Warum? Der Fluss steigt und fällt den größten Teil von 40 Fuß. Und die Hälfte des Landes ist ein Morast, den man nicht überqueren kann. Warum sollte nicht etwas Neues und Wunderbares in einem solchen Land liegen? Und warum sollten nicht wir die Männer sein, die es herausfinden? Außerdem, fügte er hinzu, sein seltsames, hageres Gesicht leuchtete vor Freude, gibt es in jeder Meile ein sportliches Risiko. Ich bin wie ein alter Golfball, ich habe schon lange die ganze weiße Farbe abgeschlagen bekommen. Das Leben kann mich jetzt herumschlagen, und es kann keine Spuren hinterlassen, aber ein sportliches Risiko, junger Bursche, das ist das Salz der Existenz. Dann ist es wieder lebenswert und wir werden alle viel zu weich und stumpf und bequem. Gib mir die großen Ödländer und die weiten Räume, mit einer Waffe in der Faust und etwas, das es wert ist, gefunden zu werden. Ich habe Krieg und Hindernisrennen und Flugzeuge ausprobiert, aber diese Jagd auf Bestien, die wie ein Hummerschmaustraum aussehen, ist eine brandneue Sensation. Er kicherte vor Vergnügen bei der Aussicht. Vielleicht habe ich mich zu lange mit diesem neuen Bekannten aufgehalten, aber er soll mein Kamerad für viele Tage sein. Und so habe ich versucht, ihn so darzustellen, wie ich ihn zum ersten Mal sah, mit seiner skurrilen Persönlichkeit und seinen merkwürdigen kleinen Sprech- und Denkweisen. Es war nur die Notwendigkeit, den Bericht über mein Treffen zu bekommen, die mich schließlich von seiner Gesellschaft wegzog. Ich ließ ihn inmitten seines rosafarbenen Scheins sitzen, den Verschluss seines Lieblingsgewehrs ölen, während er immer noch vor sich hin kicherte bei dem Gedanken an die Abenteuer, die uns erwarteten. Mir war sehr klar, dass, wenn Gefahren vor uns lagen, ich in ganz England keinen kühleren Kopf oder einen mutigeren Geist hätte finden können, um sie zu teilen. In dieser Nacht saß ich, so müde ich nach den wunderbaren Ereignissen des Tages war, lange mit McArdle, dem Nachrichtenredakteur, zusammen und erklärte ihm die ganze Situation, die er für wichtig genug hielt, um sie am nächsten Morgen Sir George Beaumont, dem Chef, zur Kenntnis zu bringen. Es wurde vereinbart, Sir, dass ich vollständige Berichte über meine Abenteuer in Form von aufeinanderfolgenden Briefen an McArdle nach Hause schreiben sollte und dass diese entweder für die Gazette bearbeitet werden sollten, sobald sie eintrafen, oder zurückgehalten werden sollten, um später veröffentlicht zu werden. je nach den Wünschen von Professor Challenger, da wir noch nicht wissen konnten, welche Bedingungen er an jene Anweisungen knüpfen würde, die uns zu dem unbekannten Land führen sollten. Als Antwort auf eine telefonische Anfrage erhielten wir nichts Bestimmteres als eine Tirade gegen die Presse, die mit der Bemerkung endete, dass, wenn wir unser Boot benachrichtigen würden, er uns Anweisungen übergeben würde, die er für angebracht hielt, uns zum Zeitpunkt des Starts zu geben. Eine zweite Frage von uns brachte überhaupt keine Antwort hervor, außer einem klagenden Blöken von seiner Frau, dass ihr Mann bereits in einer sehr heftigen Stimmung sei und dass sie hoffte, wir würden nichts tun, um es noch schlimmer zu machen. Ein dritter Versuch, später am Tag, löste einen furchtbaren Knall aus und eine spätere Nachricht von der Zentrale, dass der Empfänger von Professor Challenger zerbrochen sei. Danach gaben wir jeden Versuch der Kommunikation auf. Und nun, meine geduldigen Leser, kann ich Sie nicht mehr direkt ansprechen. Von nun an kann es, wenn überhaupt eine Fortsetzung dieser Erzählung Sie jemals erreichen sollte, nur noch durch die Zeitung geschehen, die ich vertrete. In die Hände des Herausgebers überlasse ich diesen Bericht über die Ereignisse, die zu einer der bemerkenswertesten Expeditionen aller Zeiten geführt haben, damit, falls ich nie nach England zurückkehre, eine Aufzeichnung darüber vorhanden ist, wie die Sache zustande kam. Ich schreibe diese letzten Zeilen im Salon des Boothliners Franziska, und sie werden mit dem Lotsen an Mr. McArdle zurückgehen. Lassen Sie mich ein letztes Bild zeichnen, bevor ich das Notizbuch schließe, ein Bild, das die letzte Erinnerung an das alte Land ist, die ich mit mir nehme. Es ist ein nasser, nebliger Morgen im späten Frühling, ein dünner, kalter Regen fällt. 3 glänzende Gestalten in Regencapes gehen die Kai hinunter und steuern auf die Gangway des großen Liners zu, von dem der Blue Peter weht. Vor ihnen schiebt ein Gepäckträger einen Karren, der hoch mit Koffern, Wickeln und Waffenkoffern beladen ist. Professor Summerlee, eine lange, melancholische Gestalt, geht mit schleppenden Schritten und gesenktem Kopf, wie jemand, der sich bereits zutiefst selbst bemitleidet. Lord John Roxton schreitet flott, und sein dünnes, eifriges Gesicht strahlt zwischen seiner Jagdkappe und seinem Schal hervor. Was mich betrifft, so bin ich froh, die geschäftigen Tage der Vorbereitung und die Qualen des Abschieds hinter mir zu haben. Und ich habe keinen Zweifel, dass ich es in meiner Haltung zeige, plötzlich, gerade als wir das Schiff erreichen, gibt es einen Ruf hinter uns. Es ist Professor Challenger, der versprochen hatte, uns zu verabschieden. Er rennt uns nach, eine keuchende, rotgesichtige, jähzornige Gestalt. »Nein, danke«, sagt er. »Ich möchte lieber nicht an Bord gehen. Ich habe nur ein paar Worte an Sie zu richten, und sie können sehr gut dort gesagt werden, wo wir sind. Ich bitte Sie, nicht zu glauben, dass ich Ihnen in irgendeiner Weise zu Dank verpflichtet bin, weil Sie diese Reise machen. Ich möchte, dass Sie verstehen, dass es mir vollkommen gleichgültig ist, und ich weigere mich, den entferntesten Sinn für eine persönliche Verpflichtung zu empfinden. Wahrheit ist Wahrheit, und nichts, was Sie berichten können, kann Sie in irgendeiner Weise beeinflussen, obwohl es die Emotionen erregen und die Neugier einer Reihe von sehr wirkungslosen Menschen stillen mag. Meine Anweisungen für Ihre Unterweisung und Führung befinden sich in diesem versiegelten Umschlag. Sie werden ihn öffnen, wenn Sie eine Stadt am Amazonas erreichen, die Manaus genannt wird, aber nicht vor dem Datum und der Stunde, die auf der Außenseite markiert sind. Habe ich mich klar ausgedrückt? Die strikte Einhaltung meiner Bedingungen überlasse ich ganz Ihrer Ehre. Nein, Mr. Malone, ich werde Ihrer Korrespondenz keine Einschränkungen auferlegen, da die Lüftung der Fakten das Ziel Ihrer Reise ist. Aber ich verlange, dass Sie keine Einzelheiten über Ihr genaues Ziel angeben und dass nichts tatsächlich veröffentlicht wird, bis Sie zurückkehren. Auf Wiedersehen, Sir. Sie haben etwas getan, um meine Gefühle für den abscheulichen Beruf, dem Sie unglücklicherweise angehören, zu mildern. Auf Wiedersehen, Lord John. Die Wissenschaft ist, wie ich verstehe, ein versiegeltes Buch für Sie, aber Sie können sich zu dem Jagdgebiet beglückwünschen, das Sie erwartet. Sie werden zweifellos die Gelegenheit haben, im Viel zu beschreiben, wie Sie den hochfliegenden Dimorphodon zur Strecke gebracht haben. Und auf Wiedersehen auch Ihnen, Professor Summerlee, wenn Sie noch zur Selbstverbesserung fähig sind, wovon ich offen gesagt nicht überzeugt bin, werden Sie sicherlich als weiserer Mann nach London zurückkehren. So wandte er sich auf dem Absatz um, und eine Minute später konnte ich von Deck aus seine kurze, gedrungene Gestalt in der Ferne auf- und abwackeln sehen, als er sich auf den Weg zu seinem Zug machte. Nun, wir sind jetzt gut im Ärmelkanal unterwegs. Es läutet die letzte Glocke für Briefe und es heißt Abschied vom Lotsen. Wir werden von nun an unten, Rumpf unten, auf dem alten Pfad sein. Gott segne alles, was wir zurücklassen und schicke uns sicher zurück. Kapitel 17. Morgen verschwinden wir im Unbekannten. Ich werde diejenigen, die diese Erzählung erreicht, nicht mit einem Bericht über unsere luxuriöse Reise auf dem Booth-Liner langweilen. Noch werde ich von unserem einwöchigen Aufenthalt in Para erzählen, außer dass ich die große Freundlichkeit der Pereira da Pinta Company anerkennen möchte, uns bei der Zusammenstellung unserer Ausrüstung geholfen zu haben. Ich werde auch nur sehr kurz auf unsere Flussreise eingehen. Auf einem breiten, sich langsam bewegenden, lehmfarbenen Strom in einem Dampfer, der nur wenig kleiner war als der uns über den Atlantik getragen hatte. Schließlich fanden wir uns durch die Engpässe von Obidos und erreichten die Stadt Manaus. Hier wurden wir von den begrenzten Attraktionen des örtlichen Gasthauses von Mr. Shortman, dem Vertreter der British and Brazilian Trading Company, gerettet. In seiner gastfreundlichen Fazenda verbrachten wir unsere Zeit bis zu dem Tag, an dem wir ermächtigt waren, Baltios den Anweisungsbrief zu öffnen, den uns Professor Challenger gegeben hatte. Bevor ich zu den überraschenden Ereignissen dieses Datums komme, möchte ich eine klarere Skizze meiner Kameraden in diesem Unternehmen und der Gefährten, die wir bereits in Südamerika zusammengebracht hatten, geben. Ich spreche frei und überlasse die Verwendung meines Materials Ihrem eigenen Ermessen, Mr. McArdle, da dieser Bericht durch Ihre Hände gehen muss, bevor er die Welt erreicht. Die wissenschaftlichen Errungenschaften von Professor Summerlee sind zu bekannt, als dass ich mich bemühen müsste, sie zu rekapitulieren. Er ist besser für eine raue Expedition dieser Art gerüstet, als man auf den ersten Blick annehmen würde. Seine große, hagere, sehnige Gestalt ist unempfindlich gegen Müdigkeit, und seine trockene, halb sarkastische und oft völlig unsympathische Art wird durch keine Veränderung in seiner Umgebung beeinflusst. Obwohl er in seinem 66. Lebensjahr ist, habe ich ihn nie gehört, dass er irgendeine Unzufriedenheit über die gelegentlichen Härten geäußert hätte, denen wir begegnen mussten. Ich hatte seine Anwesenheit als eine Belastung für die Expedition angesehen, aber tatsächlich bin ich jetzt fest davon überzeugt, dass seine Ausdauer so groß ist wie meine eigene. Vom Gemüt her ist er von Natur aus sauer und skeptisch. Von Anfang an hat er seinen Glauben nie verborgen, dass Professor Challenger ein absoluter Betrüger ist, dass wir alle auf einer absurden, sinnlosen Jagd sind und dass wir in Südamerika nichts als Enttäuschung und Gefahr und in England entsprechende Lächerlichkeit ernten werden. Solche Ansichten, die er mit viel leidenschaftlicher Verzerrung seiner dünnen Züge und dem Wackeln seines dünnen, ziegenartigen Bartes in unsere Ohren goss, hörten wir den ganzen Weg von Southampton nach Manaus. Seitdem wir vom Boot gegangen sind, hat er Trost in der Schönheit und Vielfalt des Insekten- und Vogellebens um ihn herum gefunden. Denn er ist absolut von ganzem Herzen der Wissenschaft hingegeben. Er verbringt seine Tage damit, mit seinem Gewehr und seinem Schmetterlingsnetz durch die Wälder zu huschen und seine Abende damit die vielen Exemplare zu montieren, die er erworben hat. Zu seinen kleineren Eigenheiten gehören, dass er nachlässig in Bezug auf seine Kleidung, unsauber in seiner Person, äußerst zerstreut in seinen Gewohnheiten ist und dazu neigt, eine kurze Dornenpfeife zu rauchen, die selten aus seinem Mund ist. Er war in seiner Jugend auf mehreren wissenschaftlichen Expeditionen. Er war mit Robertson in Papua, und das Leben des Lagers und des Kanus ist nichts Neues für ihn. Lord John Roxton hat einige Gemeinsamkeiten mit Professor Summerlee und andere, in denen sie das genaue Gegenteil voneinander sind. Er ist 20 Jahre jünger, hat aber etwas von derselben schlanken, knochigen Statur, was sein Aussehen betrifft. So habe ich es wie ich mich erinnere, in dem Teil meiner Erzählung beschrieben, den ich in London zurückgelassen habe. Er ist äußerst ordentlich und steif in seinen Wegen, kleidet sich immer mit großer Sorgfalt in weiße Drillanzüge und hohe braune Moskitostiefel und rasiert sich mindestens einmal am Tag. Wie die meisten Menschen der Tat ist er wortkarg in der Sprache und versinkt bereitwillig in seinen eigenen Gedanken. Aber er ist immer schnell, eine Frage zu beantworten oder sich in ein Gespräch einzumischen, redet auf eine seltsame, ruckartige, halb humorvolle Weise. Sein Wissen über die Welt und ganz besonders über Südamerika ist überraschend, und er hat einen von ganzem Herzen kommenden Glauben an die Möglichkeiten unserer Reise, der nicht durch das Spötteln von Professor Summerlee getrübt werden kann. Er hat eine sanfte Stimme und eine ruhige Art. Aber hinter seinen funkelnden blauen Augen lauert eine Fähigkeit zu wütendem Zorn und unerbittlicher Entschlossenheit, die umso gefährlicher ist, weil sie in Schach gehalten wird. Er sprach wenig von seinen eigenen Heldentaten in Brasilien und Peru, aber es war eine Offenbarung für mich, die Aufregung zu sehen, die seine Anwesenheit unter den Ureinwohnern am Fluss verursachte, die ihn als ihren Champion und Beschützer ansahen. Die Heldentaten des roten Häuptlings, wie sie ihn nannten, waren zu Legenden unter ihnen geworden. Aber die wahren Fakten, soweit ich sie erfahren konnte, waren erstaunlich genug. Diese waren, dass Lord John sich einige Jahre zuvor in jenem Niemandsland befunden hatte, das durch die halb definierten Grenzen zwischen Peru, Brasilien und Kolumbien gebildet wird. In diesem großen Distrikt gedeiht der wilde Gummibaum und ist, wie im Kongo, zu einem Fluch für die Eingeborenen geworden, der nur mit ihrer Zwangsarbeit unter den Spaniern in den alten Silberminen von Darien verglichen werden kann. Eine Handvoll schurkischer Mestizen beherrschte das Land, bewaffnete solche Indianer, die sie unterstützen würden, und machte den Rest zu Sklaven, terrorisierte sie mit den unmenschlichsten Folterungen, um sie zu zwingen, den Kautschuk zu sammeln, der dann den Fluss hinunter nach Para geflößt wurde. Lord John Roxton protestierte im Namen der unglücklichen Opfer und erhielt für seine Mühen nichts als Drohungen und Beleidigungen. Er erklärte dann offiziell den Krieg gegen Pedro Lopez, den Führer der Sklaventreiber, schrieb eine Bande von entlaufenen Sklaven in seinen Dienst ein, bewaffnete sie und führte einen Feldzug, der damit endete, dass er den berüchtigten Mestizen mit eigenen Händen tötete und das System, das er vertrat, brach. Kein Wunder, dass der ingwerhaarige Mann mit der seidigen Stimme und den freien und einfachen Manieren jetzt am Ufer des großen südamerikanischen Flusses mit großem Interesse betrachtet wurde, obwohl die Gefühle, die er hervorrief, natürlich gemischt waren, da die Dankbarkeit der Eingeborenen der Groll derer entsprach, die sie ausbeuten wollten. Ein nützliches Ergebnis seiner früheren Erfahrungen war, dass er fließend in der Lingua Geral sprechen konnte, die eigentümliche Sprache ist. 1/3 Portugiesisch und 2/3 Indianisch, die in ganz Brasilien verbreitet ist. Ich habe bereits gesagt, dass Lord John Roxton ein Südamerikamaniker war. Er konnte nicht über dieses große Land sprechen, ohne in Eifer zu geraten. Und dieser Eifer war ansteckend, denn so unwissend ich auch war. Er fesselte meine Aufmerksamkeit und stimulierte meine Neugier. Wie sehr wünsche ich mir, ich könnte den Glamour seiner Reden wiedergeben. Die eigentümliche Mischung aus genauer Kenntnis und rasanter Vorstellungskraft, die ihnen ihre Faszination verlieh, bis sogar das zynische und skeptische Lächeln des Professors allmählich von seinem dünnen Gesicht verschwand. Während er zuhörte, er würde die Geschichte des mächtigen Flusses erzählen, der so schnell erforscht wurde, denn einige der ersten Eroberer Perus überquerten den gesamten Kontinent tatsächlich auf seinen Gewässern. Und doch so unbekannt in Bezug auf alles, was sich hinter seinen sich ständig verändernden Ufern befand. »Was ist da?« würde er rufen und nach Norden zeigen. »Holz und Sumpf und undurchdringlicher Dschungel. Wer weiß, was er beherbergt, und dort im Süden eine Wildnis aus sumpfigem Wald, wo noch nie ein weißer Mann war. Das Unbekannte steht uns auf jeder Seite gegenüber. Außerhalb der engen Linien der Flüsse. Was weiß irgendjemand? Wer wird sagen, was in einem solchen Land möglich ist? Warum sollte der alte Mann Challenger nicht recht haben?« Bei diesem direkten Trotz würde das hartnäckige Grinsen wieder auf Professor Summerlees Gesicht erscheinen, und er würde seinen sardonischen Kopf in unsympathischem Schweigen schüttelnd, hinter der Wolke seiner Dornenwurzelpfeife sitzen. So viel für den Moment zu meinen beiden weißen Gefährten, deren Charaktere und Grenzen, so sicher wie meine eigenen, im Verlauf dieser Erzählung weiter offengelegt werden. Aber wir haben bereits bestimmte Gefolgsleute angeworben, die eine nicht kleine Rolle in dem, was kommen wird, spielen könnten. Der erste ist ein gigantischer Neger namens Sambo, der ein schwarzer Herkules ist. So willig wie jedes Pferd und ungefähr so intelligent. Ihn haben wir in Para engagiert, auf Empfehlung der Dampfschifffahrtsgesellschaft, auf deren Schiffen er gelernt hatte, ein holpriges Englisch zu sprechen. Auch in Para haben wir Gomez und Manuel engagiert. 2 Mestizen von den oberen Flussläufen, die gerade mit einer Ladung Rotholz heruntergekommen waren. Sie waren dunkelhäutige Kerle, bärtig und wild, so aktiv und drahtig wie Panther. Beide hatten ihr Leben in jenen oberen Gewässern des Amazonas verbracht, die wir erkunden wollten. Und es war diese Empfehlung, die Lord John dazu veranlasste, sie zu engagieren. Einer von ihnen, Gomez, hatte den weiteren Vorteil, dass er ausgezeichnetes Englisch sprechen konnte. Diese Männer waren bereit, als unsere persönlichen Diener zu fungieren, zu kochen, zu rudern oder sich in irgendeiner Weise nützlich zu machen, gegen eine Bezahlung von $15 im Monat. Außerdem hatten wir 3 Mojo-Indianer aus Bolivien engagiert, die von allen Flussstämmen die geschicktesten im Fischen und in der Bootsarbeit sind. Den Häuptling von ihnen nannten wir Mojo, nach seinem Stamm, und die anderen sind als Jose und Fernando bekannt. 3 weiße Männer also. 2 Mestizen, ein Neger und 3 Indianer bildeten das Personal der kleinen Expedition, die in Manaus auf ihre Anweisungen wartete, bevor sie ihre einzigartige Suche antrat. Endlich, nach einer ermüdenden Woche, war der Tag und die Stunde gekommen. Ich bitte Sie, sich das schattige Wohnzimmer der Fazenda San Ignacio vorzustellen, 2 Meilen landeinwärts von der Stadt Manaus. Draußen lag der gelbe, messingfarbene Glanz des Sonnenscheins, mit den Schatten der Palmen so schwarz und klar wie die Bäume selbst. Die Luft war ruhig, voller des ewigen Summens von Insekten, eines tropischen Chors von vielen Oktaven, vom tiefen Brummen der Biene bis zum hohen, scharfen Piepen der Mücke. Jenseits der Veranda befand sich ein kleiner, gerodeter Garten, der von Kaktushecken begrenzt und mit Büscheln von blühenden Sträuchern geschmückt war, um die großen blauen Schmetterlinge und die winzigen Kolibris in Halbmonden aus funkelndem Licht flatterten und huschten. Drinnen saßen wir um den Rohrtisch, auf dem ein versiegelter Umschlag lag. Darauf waren, in der gezackten Handschrift von Professor Challenger, die Worte eingeschrieben: Anweisungen an Lord John Roxton und Partei. In Manaus am 15. Juli, genau um 12 Uhr zu öffnen. Lord John hatte seine Uhr neben sich auf den Tisch gelegt. Wir haben noch 7 Minuten, sagte er. Der alte Schatz ist sehr präzise. Professor Summerlee lächelte sauer, als er den Umschlag in seine hagere Hand nahm. Was kann es schon ausmachen, ob wir ihn jetzt oder in 7 Minuten öffnen? sagte er. Es ist alles Teil desselben Systems von Quacksalberei und Unsinn, für das der Verfasser, wie ich bedauerlicherweise sagen muss, berüchtigt ist. »Oh, komm schon, wir müssen das Spiel nach den Regeln spielen«, sagte Lord John. »Es ist die Show des alten Challenger, und wir sind hier durch seinen guten Willen, also wäre es eine verdammt schlechte Form, wenn wir seine Anweisungen nicht buchstabengetreu befolgen würden.« »Ein schönes Geschäft ist das«, rief der Professor bitter. »Es kam mir in London schon widersinnig vor, aber ich muss sagen, dass es mir bei näherem Kennenlernen noch mehr so vorkommt. Ich weiß nicht, was in diesem Umschlag ist, aber wenn es nicht etwas ziemlich Definitives ist, werde ich sehr versucht sein, das nächste Boot flussabwärts zu nehmen und die Bolivia in Para zu erwischen. Schließlich habe ich in der Welt eine verantwortungsvollere Arbeit zu tun, als herumlaufen und die Behauptungen eines Verrückten zu widerlegen. Nun, Roxton, es ist doch sicher Zeit.« »Zeit ist es«, sagte Lord John. »Du kannst die Pfeife blasen.« Er nahm den Umschlag und schnitt ihn mit seinem Taschenmesser auf. Daraus zog er ein gefaltetes Blatt Papier. Dies öffnete er sorgfältig und legte es flach auf den Tisch. Es war ein leeres Blatt. Er drehte es um. Wieder war es leer. Wir sahen uns in verwirrter Stille an, die durch einen misstönenden Ausbruch von höhnischem Gelächter von Professor Summerlee unterbrochen wurde. »Es ist ein offenes Eingeständnis«, rief er. »Was wollen Sie mehr? Der Kerl ist ein selbstgeständiger Hochstapler. Wir müssen nur nach Hause zurückkehren und ihn als den unverschämten Betrüger melden, der er ist.« »Unsichtbare Tinte«, schlug ich vor. »Ich glaube nicht«, sagte Lord Roxton und hielt das Papier gegen das Licht. »Nein, junger Bursche, mein Junge, es hat keinen Sinn, dich selbst zu täuschen. Ich wette, dass nie etwas auf dieses Papier geschrieben wurde.« »Darf ich hereinkommen?«, dröhnte eine Stimme von der Veranda. Der Schatten einer gedrungenen Gestalt war über den Fleck des Sonnenlichts geschlichen. Diese Stimme, diese monströse Schulterbreite. Wir sprangen mit einem Schrei der Verblüffung auf, als Challenger, in einem runden, jungenhaften Strohhut mit einem farbigen Band. Challenger, mit den Händen in seinen Jackentaschen und seinen Segelschuhen, die er beim Gehen zierlich aufsetzte, im offenen Raum vor uns erschien. Er warf seinen Kopf zurück, und dort stand er im goldenen Schein mit all seiner alten assyrischen Üppigkeit des Bartes, all seiner angeborenen Frechheit der herabhängenden Augenlider und intoleranten Augen. »Ich fürchte«, sagte er, seine Uhr herausnehmend, »dass ich ein paar Minuten zu spät bin, als ich Ihnen diesen Umschlag gab, muss ich gestehen, dass ich nie beabsichtigt hatte, dass Sie ihn öffnen sollten, denn es war meine feste Absicht, vor der Stunde bei Ihnen zu sein. Die unglückliche Verzögerung kann auf einen unbeholfenen Lotsen und eine aufdringliche Sandbank verteilt werden. Ich fürchte, dass es meinem Kollegen, Professor Summerlee, Anlass zum Lästern gegeben hat.« »Ich muss sagen, Sir«, sagte Lord John mit etwas Ernst in der Stimme, »dass Ihr Auftauchen eine beträchtliche Erleichterung für uns ist, denn unsere Mission schien zu einem vorzeitigen Ende gekommen zu sein. Selbst jetzt kann ich beim besten Willen nicht verstehen, warum Sie es auf eine so außergewöhnliche Weise inszeniert haben.« Statt zu antworten, trat Professor Challenger ein, schüttelte mir und Lord John die Hand. verbeugte sich mit schwerfälliger Unverschämtheit vor Professor Summerlee und sank zurück in einen Korbstuhl, der unter seinem Gewicht knarrte und schwankte. »Ist alles bereit für Ihre Reise?« fragte er. »Wir können morgen starten.« »Dann werden Sie das. Sie brauchen jetzt keine Wegbeschreibung mehr, da Sie den unschätzbaren Vorteil meiner eigenen Führung haben werden. Von Anfang an hatte ich beschlossen, dass ich selbst Ihre Untersuchung leiten würde. Die aufwendigsten Karten wären, wie Sie ohne weiteres zugeben werden, ein armseliger Ersatz für meine eigene Intelligenz und meinen Rat. Was die kleine List betrifft, die ich Ihnen in Bezug auf den Umschlag gespielt habe, so ist es klar, dass, hätte ich Ihnen all meine Absichten mitgeteilt, ich gezwungen gewesen wäre, mich einem unerwünschten Druck zu widersetzen, mit Ihnen zu reisen.« »Nicht von mir, Sir«, rief Professor Summerlee herzlich aus, »solange es noch ein anderes Schiff auf dem Atlantik gab.« Challenger winkte ihn mit seiner großen, behaarten Hand weg. »Ihr gesunder Menschenverstand wird, da bin ich mir sicher, meinen Einwand unterstützen und erkennen, dass es besser war, dass ich meine eigenen Bewegungen lenkte und nur in dem genauen Moment erschien, als meine Anwesenheit benötigt wurde. Dieser Moment ist jetzt gekommen. Sie sind in sicheren Händen. Sie werden jetzt nicht scheitern, Ihr Ziel zu erreichen. Von nun an übernehme ich das Kommando über diese Expedition und ich muss Sie bitten, Ihre Vorbereitungen heute Abend abzuschließen, damit wir morgen früh aufbrechen können. Meine Zeit ist wertvoll. Und das Gleiche kann zweifellos in geringerem Maße von Ihrer eigenen gesagt werden. Ich schlage daher vor, dass wir so schnell wie möglich vorankommen, bis ich demonstriert habe, was Sie gekommen sind, um zu sehen. Lord John Roxton hat einen großen Dampfer, die Esmeralda, gechartert, die uns den Fluss hinauffahren sollte. Was das Klima betrifft, so war es unerheblich, welche Zeit wir für unsere Expedition wählten, da die Temperatur sowohl im Sommer als auch im Winter von 75 bis 90 Grad reicht, ohne spürbaren Unterschied in der Hitze. In der Feuchtigkeit ist es jedoch anders. Von Dezember bis Mai ist die Zeit der Regenfälle. Und während dieser Zeit steigt der Fluss langsam an, bis er eine Höhe von fast 40 Fuß über seinem Niedrigwasserstand erreicht. Er überflutet die Ufer. Er streckt sich in großen Lagunen über eine monströse Fläche des Landes und bildet ein riesiges Gebiet, das lokal Gapo genannt wird, das größtenteils zu sumpfig für Fußreisen und zu flach für Bootsfahrten ist. Etwa im Juni beginnt das Wasser zu fallen und ist im Oktober oder November am niedrigsten. So fand unsere Expedition zur Zeit der Trockenzeit statt, als der große Fluss und seine Nebenflüsse mehr oder weniger in einem normalen Zustand waren. Die Strömung des Flusses ist gering, der Abfall beträgt nicht mehr als 8 Zoll auf eine Meile. Kein Strom könnte bequemer für die Schifffahrt sein, da der vorherrschende Wind Südost ist und Segelboote einen kontinuierlichen Fortschritt zur peruanischen Grenze machen können, um dann mit der Strömung wieder flussabwärts zu fahren. In unserem Fall konnten die ausgezeichneten Motoren der Esmeralda die träge Strömung des Stroms ignorieren, und wir machten so schnelle Fortschritte, als würden wir einen stehenden See befahren. 3 Tage lang fuhren wir nordwestlich einen Strom hinauf, der selbst hier 1000 Meilen von seiner Mündung entfernt immer noch so enorm war, dass vom Zentrum aus die beiden Ufer bloße Schatten am fernen Horizont waren. Am 4. Tag nach dem Verlassen von Manaus bogen wir in einen Nebenfluss ein, der an seiner Mündung nur wenig kleiner war als der Hauptstrom. Er verengte sich jedoch schnell, und nach 2 weiteren Tagen Dampffahrt erreichten wir ein indianisches Dorf, wo der Professor darauf bestand, dass wir an Land gehen sollten und die Esmeralda nach Manaus zurückgeschickt werden sollte. Wir würden bald auf Stromschnellen stoßen, erklärte er, die eine weitere Nutzung unmöglich machen würden. Er fügte privat hinzu, dass wir uns jetzt der Tür des unbekannten Landes näherten und dass es umso besser wäre. Je weniger wir in unser Vertrauen zogen zu diesem Zweck, gab jeder von uns auch unser Ehrenwort, dass wir nichts veröffentlichen oder sagen würden, was einen genauen Anhaltspunkt für den Aufenthaltsort unserer Reisen geben würde, während die Diener alle feierlich auf dasselbe vereidigt wurden. Aus diesem Grund bin ich gezwungen, in meiner Erzählung vage zu sein, und ich möchte meine Leser warnen, dass in jeder Karte oder jedem Diagramm, die ich geben mag, die Beziehung der Orte zueinander korrekt sein kann, aber die Himmelsrichtungen sorgfältig durcheinander gebracht sind, so dass sie in keiner Weise als eine tatsächliche Anleitung für das Land genommen werden kann. Professor Challengers Gründe für die Geheimhaltung mögen gültig sein oder nicht, aber wir hatten keine andere Wahl, als sie zu übernehmen, denn er war bereit, die gesamte Expedition aufzugeben, anstatt die Bedingungen zu ändern, unter denen er uns führen würde. Es war der 2. August, als wir unser letztes Glied mit der Außenwelt abbrachen, indem wir uns von der Esmeralda verabschiedeten. Seitdem sind 4 Tage vergangen, in denen wir 2 große Kanus von den Indianern engagiert haben, die aus so leichtem Material heute über einem Bambusgerüst bestehen, dass wir sie um jedes Hindernis herumtragen könnten. Diese haben wir mit all unseren Habseligkeiten beladen und 2 zusätzliche Indianer engagiert, um uns bei der Navigation zu helfen. Ich verstehe, dass es genau die beiden sind, Ataka und Ipetu mit Namen, die Professor Challenger auf seiner früheren Reise begleitet haben. Sie schienen von der Aussicht, sie zu wiederholen, entsetzt zu sein. Aber der Häuptling hat patriarchalische Befugnisse in diesen Ländern, und wenn der Handel in seinen Augen gut ist, hat der Stammesangehörige wenig Wahl in der Angelegenheit. Also verschwinden wir morgen im Unbekannten. Diesen Bericht übermittle ich mit dem Kanu den Fluss hinunter, und es könnte unser letztes Wort an diejenigen sein, die an unserem Schicksal interessiert sind. Ich habe ihn, gemäß unserer Vereinbarung, an Sie gerichtet, mein lieber Mr. McArdle, und ich überlasse es Ihrem Ermessen, zu löschen, zu ändern oder zu tun, was Sie damit möchten. Aus der Sicherheit der Art und Weise von Professor Challenger und trotz des andauernden Skeptizismus von Professor Summerlee habe ich keinen Zweifel, dass unser Führer seine Aussage untermauern wird und dass wir wirklich am Vorabend einiger bemerkenswerter Erlebnisse stehen. Chapter 1 The Outlying Pickets of the New World. My friends at home may well rejoice with us, for we are at our goal, and up to a point, at least, we have shown that the statement of Professor Challenger can be verified. We have not, it is true, ascended the plateau, but it lies before us, And even Professor Summerlee is in a more chastened mood. Not that he will for an instant admit that his rival could be right, but he is less persistent in his incessant objections, and has sunk for the most part into an observant silence. I must hark back, however, and continue my narrative from where I dropped it. We are sending home one of our local Indians who is injured, and I am committing this letter to his charge, with considerable doubts in my mind as to whether it will ever come to hand. When I wrote last, we were about to leave the Indian village where we had been deposited by the Esmeralda. I have to begin my report by bad news. For the first serious personal trouble, I pass over the incessant bickerings between the professors occurred this evening, and might have had a tragic ending. I have spoken of our English-speaking half-breed, Gomez, a fine worker and a willing fellow, but afflicted, I fancy, with the vice of curiosity which is common enough among such men. On the last evening he seems to have hid himself near the hut in which we were discussing our plans, and, being observed by our huge Negro Zambo, who is as faithful as a dog and has the hatred which all his race bear to the half-breeds, he was dragged out and carried into our presence. Gomez whipped out his knife, however, and but for the huge strength of his captor, which enabled him to disarm him with one hand, he would certainly have stabbed him. The matter has ended in reprimands. The opponents have been compelled to shake hands, and there is every hope that all will be well. As to the feuds of the two learned men, they are continuous and bitter. It must be admitted that Challenger is provocative in the last degree, but Summerlee has an acid tongue, which makes matters worse. Last night Challenger said that he never cared to walk on the Thames embankment and look up the river, as it was always sad to see one's own eventual goal. He is convinced, of course, that he is destined for Westminster Abbey, Summerlee rejoined, however, with a sour smile, by saying that he understood that Millbank Prison had been pulled down. Challenger's conceit is too colossal to allow him to be really annoyed. He only smiled in his beard and repeated, "Really, really," in the pitying tone one would use to a child. Indeed, they are children both, the one wizened and cantankerous, the other formidable and overbearing, yet each with a brain which has put him in the front rank of his scientific age. Brain, character, soul. Only as one sees more of life does one understand how distinct is each. The very next day we did actually make our start upon this remarkable expedition. We found that all our possessions fitted very easily into the two canoes, and we divided our personnel, 6 in each, taking the obvious precaution in the interests of peace of putting one professor into each canoe. Personally, I was with Challenger, who was in a beatific humor, moving about as one in a silent ecstasy and beaming benevolence from every feature. I have had some experience of him in other moods, however, and shall be the less surprised when the thunderstorms suddenly come up amidst the sunshine. If it is impossible to be at your ease, it is equally impossible to be dull in his company, for one is always in a state of half-tremulous doubt as to what sudden turn his formidable temper may take. For 2 days we made our way up a good-sized river some hundreds of yards broad, and dark in color, but transparent, so that one could usually see the bottom. The affluents of the Amazon are, half of them, of this nature, while the other half are whitish and opaque. The difference depending upon the class of country through which they have flowed. The dark indicate vegetable decay, while the others point to clayey soil. Twice we came across rapids, and in each case made a portage of half a mile or so to avoid them. The woods on either side were primeval, which are more easily penetrated than woods of the second growth, and we had no great difficulty in carrying our canoes through them. How shall I ever forget the solemn mystery of it? The height of the trees and the thickness of the boles exceeded anything which I in my town-bred life could have imagined, shooting upwards in magnificent columns until, at an enormous distance above our heads, we could dimly discern the spot where they threw out their side branches into Gothic upward curves which coalesced to form one great matted roof of verdure, through which only an occasional golden ray of sunshine shot downwards to trace a thin dazzling line of light amidst the majestic obscurity. As we walked noiselessly amid the thick, soft carpet of decaying vegetation, the hush fell upon our souls which comes upon us in the twilight of the abbey, and even Professor Challenger's full-chested notes sank into a whisper. Alone, I should have been ignorant of the names of these giant growths. But our men of science pointed out the cedars, the great silk cotton trees, and the redwood trees, with all that profusion of various plants which has made this continent the chief supplier to the human race of those gifts of nature which depend upon the vegetable world, while it is the most backward in those products which come from animal life. Vivid orchids and wonderful colored lichens smoldered upon the swarthy tree trunks, and where a wandering shaft of light fell full upon the golden alamander, the scarlet star clusters of the taxonia, or the rich deep blue of ipomoea, the effect was as a dream of fairyland. In these great wastes of forest, life, which abhors darkness, struggles ever upwards to the light. Every plant, even the smaller ones, curls and writhes to the green surface, twining itself round its stronger and taller brethren in the effort. Climbing plants are monstrous and luxuriant, but others which have never been known to climb elsewhere learn the art as an escape from that sombre shadow, so that the common nettle, the jasmine, and even the jasitara palm tree can be seen circling the stems of the cedars and striving to reach their crowns. Of animal life there was no movement amid the majestic vaulted aisles which stretched from us as we walked, but a constant movement far above our heads told of that multitudinous world of snake and monkey, bird and sloth, which lived in the sunshine, and looked down in wonder at our tiny, dark, stumbling figures in the obscure depths immeasurably below them. At dawn and at sunset, the howler monkeys screamed together and the parakeets broke into shrill chatter. But during the hot hours of the day only the full drone of insects, like the beat of a distant surf, filled the ear, while nothing moved amid the solemn vistas of stupendous trunks, fading away into the darkness which held us in. Once some bandy-legged, lurching creature, an ant-eater or a bear, scuttled clumsily amid the shadows. It was the only sign of earth life which I saw in this great Amazonian forest. And yet there were indications that even human life itself was not far from us in those mysterious recesses. On the third day out we were aware of a singular, deep throbbing in the air, rhythmic and solemn, coming and going fitfully throughout the morning. The two boats were paddling within a few yards of each other when first we heard it, and our Indians remained motionless, as if they had been turned to bronze, listening intently with expressions of terror upon their faces. "What is it, then?" I asked. "Drums," said Lord John carelessly. "War drums, I have heard them before." "Yes, sir, war drums," said Gomez, the half-breed. "Wild Indians, bravos, not mansos. They watch us every mile of the way, kill us if they can." "How can they watch us?" I asked, gazing into the dark, motionless void. The half-breed shrugged his broad shoulders. "The Indians know. They have their own way. They watch us. They talk the drum talk to each other, then kill us if they can." By the afternoon of that day, my pocket diary shows me that it was Tuesday, August 18th. At least 6 or 7 drums were throbbing from various points. Sometimes they beat quickly, sometimes slowly, sometimes in obvious question and answer. One far to the east breaking out in a high staccato rattle, and being followed after a pause by a deep roll from the north. There was something indescribably nerve-shaking and menacing in that constant mutter, which seemed to shape itself into the very syllables of the half-breed, endlessly repeated. "We will kill you if we can. We will kill you if we can." No one ever moved in the silent woods. All the peace and soothing of quiet nature lay in that dark curtain of vegetation, but away from behind there came ever the one message from our fellow man. "We will kill you if we can," said the man in the east. "We will kill you if we can," said the man in the north. All day the drums rumbled and whispered, while their menace reflected itself in the faces of our colored companions. Even the hardy, swaggering half-breed seemed cowed. I learned, however, that day once for all, that both Summerlee and Challenger possessed that highest type of bravery, the bravery of the scientific mind. Theirs was the spirit which upheld Darwin among the gauchos of the Argentine or Wallace among the headhunters of Malaya. It is decreed by a merciful nature that the human brain cannot think of 2 things simultaneously, so that if it be steeped in curiosity as to science, it has no room for merely personal considerations. All day amid that incessant and mysterious menace, our 2 professors watched every bird upon the wing, and every shrub upon the bank, with many a sharp, wordy contention. When the snarl of Summerlee came quick upon the deep growl of Challenger, but with no more sense of danger and no more reference to drum-beating Indians than if they were seated together in the smoking room of the Royal Society's Club in St. James's Street. Once only did they condescend to discuss them. "Miranya or Amajuaca cannibals," said Challenger, jerking his thumb towards the reverberating wood. "No doubt, sir," Summerlee answered. "Like all such tribes, I shall expect to find them of polysynthetic speech and of Mongolian type." "Polysynthetic, certainly," said Challenger, indulgently. "I am not aware that any other type of language exists in this continent, and I have notes of more than 100. The Mongolian theory I regard with deep suspicion. I should have thought that even a limited knowledge of comparative anatomy would have helped to verify it," said Summerlee, bitterly. Challenger thrust out his aggressive chin until he was all beard and hat rim. "No doubt, sir. A limited knowledge would have that effect. When one's knowledge is exhaustive, one comes to other conclusions." They glared at each other in mutual defiance, while all round rose the distant whisper, "We will kill you. We will kill you if we can." That night we moored our canoes with heavy stones for anchors in the center of the stream, and made every preparation for a possible attack. Nothing came, however, and with the dawn we pushed upon our way, the drum beating dying out behind us. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon we came to a very steep rapid, more than a mile long, the very one in which Professor Challenger had suffered disaster upon his first journey. I confess that the sight of it consoled me, for it was really the first direct corroboration, slight as it was, of the truth of his story. The Indians carried first our canoes and then our stores through the brushwood, which is very thick at this point, while we, 4 whites, our rifles on our shoulders, walked between them and any danger coming from the woods. Before evening we had successfully passed the rapids and made our way some 10 miles above them, where we anchored for the night. At this point, I reckoned that we had come not less than 100 miles up the tributary from the main stream. It was in the early forenoon of the next day that we made the great departure. Since dawn, Professor Challenger had been acutely uneasy, continually scanning each bank of the river. Suddenly, he gave an exclamation of satisfaction and pointed to a single tree, which projected at a peculiar angle over the side of the stream. "What do you make of that?" he asked. "It is surely an acai palm," said Summerlee. "Exactly. It was an acai palm which I took for my landmark. The secret opening is half a mile onwards upon the other side of the river. There is no break in the trees. That is the wonder and the mystery of it. There where you see light green rushes instead of dark green undergrowth, there between the great cottonwoods, that is my private gate into the unknown. Push through, and you will understand." It was indeed a wonderful place. Having reached the spot marked by a line of light green rushes, we poled out 2 canoes through them for some hundreds of yards, and eventually emerged into a placid and shallow stream, running clear and transparent over a sandy bottom. It may have been 20 yards across, and was banked in on each side by most luxuriant vegetation. No one who had not observed that for a short distance reeds had taken the place of shrubs could possibly have guessed the existence of such a stream or dreamed of the fairyland beyond. For a fairyland it was, the most wonderful that the imagination of man could conceive. The thick vegetation met overhead, interlacing into a natural pergola, and through this tunnel of verdure in a golden twilight flowed the green, pellucid river, beautiful in itself, but marvelous from the strange tints thrown by the vivid light from above, filtered and tempered in its fall, clear as crystal, motionless as a sheet of glass, green as the edge of an iceberg. It stretched in front of us under its leafy archway, every stroke of our paddles sending 1,000 ripples across its shining surface. It was a fitting avenue to a land of wonders. All sign of the Indians had passed away, but animal life was more frequent, and the tameness of the creatures showed that they knew nothing of the hunter. Fuzzy little black velvet monkeys, with snow-white teeth and gleaming mocking eyes, chattered at us as we passed. With a dull, heavy splash, an occasional cayman plunged in from the bank. Once a dark, clumsy tapir stared at us from a gap in the bushes, and then lumbered away through the forest. Once, too, the yellow, sinuous form of a great puma whisked amid the brushwood, and its green, baleful eyes glared hatred at us over its tawny shoulder. Bird life was abundant, especially the wading birds, stork, heron, and ibis gathering in little groups, blue, scarlet, and white, upon every log which jutted from the bank, while beneath us the crystal water was alive with fish of every shape and color. For 3 days we made our way up this tunnel of hazy green sunshine. On the longer stretches one could hardly tell as one looked ahead where the distant green water ended and the distant green archway began. The deep peace of this strange waterway was unbroken by any sign of man. "No Indian here, too much afraid. Kurupuri," said Gomez. "Kurupuri is the spirit of the woods," Lord John explained. "It's a name for any kind of devil. The poor beggars think that there is something fearsome in this direction and therefore they avoid it. On the 3rd day, it became evident that our journey in the canoes could not last much longer, for the stream was rapidly growing more shallow. Twice in as many hours we stuck upon the bottom. Finally, we pulled the boats up among the brushwood and spent the night on the bank of the river. In the morning, Lord John and I made our way for a couple of miles through the forest, keeping parallel with the stream. But as it grew ever shallower, we returned and reported what Professor Challenger had already suspected, that we had reached the highest point to which the canoes could be brought. We drew them up, therefore, and concealed them among the bushes, blazing a tree with our axes, so that we should find them again. Then we distributed the various burdens among us: guns, ammunition, food, a tent, blankets, and the rest, and, shouldering our packages, we set forth upon the more laborious stage of our journey. An unfortunate quarrel between our pepper pots marked the outset of our new stage. Challenger had, from the moment of joining us, issued directions to the whole party, much to the evident discontent of Summerlee. Now, upon his assigning some duty to his fellow professor, it was only the carrying of an aneroid barometer. The matter suddenly came to a head. "May I ask, sir," said Summerlee with vicious calm, "in what capacity you take it upon yourself to issue these orders?" Challenger glared and bristled. "I do it, Professor Summerlee, as leader of this expedition. I am compelled to tell you, sir, that I do not recognize you in that capacity." "Indeed," Challenger bowed with unwieldy sarcasm. "Perhaps you would define my exact position." "Yes, sir. You are a man whose veracity is upon trial, and this committee is here to try it, or you walk, sir, with your judges." "Dear me," said Challenger, seating himself on the side of one of the canoes. "In that case you will, of course, go on your way, and I will follow at my leisure. If I am not the leader, you cannot expect me to lead." Thank heaven that there were 2 sane men, Lord John Roxton and myself, to prevent the petulance and folly of our learned professors from sending us back empty-handed to London. Such arguing and pleading and explaining before we could get them mollified. Then at last Summerlee, with his sneer and his pipe, would move forwards, and Challenger would come rolling and grumbling after. By some good fortune we discovered about this time that both our savants had the very poorest opinion of Dr. Illingworth of Edinburgh. Thenceforward that was our one safety, and every strained situation was relieved by our introducing the name of the Scotch zoologist. When both our professors would form a temporary alliance and friendship in their detestation and abuse of this common rival. Advancing in single file along the bank of the stream, we soon found that it narrowed down to a mere brook, and finally that it lost itself in a great green morass of sponge-like mosses, into which we sank up to our knees. The place was horribly haunted by clouds of mosquitoes and every form of flying pests, so we were glad to find solid ground again and to make a circuit among the trees, which enabled us to outflank this pestilent morass, which droned like an organ in the distance, so loud was it with insect life. On the second day after leaving our canoes, we found that the whole character of the country changed. Our road was persistently upwards, and as we ascended, the woods became thinner and lost their tropical luxuriance. The huge trees of the alluvial Amazonian plain gave place to the phoenix and cocoa palms, growing in scattered clumps, with thick brushwood between. In the damper hollows, the Mauritia palms threw out their graceful, drooping fronds. We travelled entirely by compass, and once or twice there were differences of opinion between Challenger and the two Indians. When, to quote the professor's indignant words, the whole party agreed to trust the fallacious instincts of undeveloped savages rather than the highest product of modern European culture. That we were justified in doing so was shown upon the third day, when Challenger admitted that he recognized several landmarks of his former journey, and in one spot we actually came upon 4 fire-blackened stones, which must have marked a camping place. The road still ascended, and we crossed a rock-studded slope which took 2 days to traverse. The vegetation had again changed, and only the vegetable ivory tree remained, with a great profusion of wonderful orchids, among which I learned to recognize the rare Newtonia vexillaria and the glorious pink and scarlet blossoms of Cattleya and Odontoglossum. Occasional brooks with pebbly bottoms and fern-draped banks gurgled down the shallow gorges in the hill and offered good camping grounds every evening on the banks of some rock-studded pool, where swarms of little blue-backed fish, about the size and shape of English trout, gave us a delicious supper. On the 9th day after leaving the canoe, having done, as I reckon, about 120 miles, we began to emerge from the trees, which had grown smaller until they were mere shrubs. Their place was taken by an immense wilderness of bamboo, which grew so thickly that we could only penetrate it by cutting a pathway with the machetes and billhooks of the Indians. It took us a long day, travelling from 7 in the morning till 8 at night, with only 2 breaks of 1 hour each, to get through this obstacle. Anything more monotonous and wearying could not be imagined, for even at the most open places, I could not see more than 10 or 12 yards, while usually my vision was limited to the back of Lord John's cotton jacket in front of me, and to the yellow wall within a foot of me on either side. From above came one thin knife edge of sunshine, and 15 feet over our heads one saw the tops of the reeds swaying against the deep blue sky. I do not know what kind of creatures inhabit such a thicket, but several times we heard the plunging of large, heavy animals quite close to us. From their sounds, Lord John judged them to be some form of wild cattle. Just as night fell, we cleared the belt of bamboos and at once formed our camp, exhausted by the interminable day. Early next morning we were again afoot and found that the character of the country had changed once again. Behind us was the wall of bamboo, as definite as if it marked the course of a river. In front was an open plain, sloping slightly upwards and dotted with clumps of tree ferns, the whole curving before us until it ended in a long, whale-backed ridge. This we reached about midday, only to find a shallow valley beyond, rising once again into a gentle incline which led to a low, rounded skyline. It was here, while we crossed the first of these hills, that an incident occurred which may or may not have been important. Professor Challenger, who with the two local Indians was in the van of the party, stopped suddenly and pointed excitedly to the right. As he did so, we saw, at the distance of a mile or so, something which appeared to be a huge grey bird flap slowly up from the ground and skim smoothly off, flying very low and straight until it was lost among the tree ferns. "Did you see it?" cried Challenger in exultation. "Summerlee, did you see it?" His colleague was staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared. "What do you claim that it was?" he asked. "To the best of my belief, a pterodactyl." Summerlee burst into derisive laughter. "A fiddlestick," said he. "It was a stork, if ever I saw one." Challenger was too furious to speak. He simply swung his pack upon his back and continued upon his march. Lord John came abreast of me, however, and his face was more grave than was his wont. He had his Zeiss glasses in his hand. "I focused it before it got over the tree," said he. "I won't undertake to say what it was, but I'll risk my reputation as a sportsman that it wasn't any bird that ever I clapped eyes on in my life." So there the matter stands. Are we really just at the edge of the unknown, encountering the outlying pickets of this lost world of which our leader speaks? I give you the incident as it occurred, and you will know as much as I do. It stands alone, for we saw nothing more which could be called remarkable. And now, my readers, if ever I have any, I have brought you up the broad river, and through the screen of rushes, and down the green tunnel, and up the long slope of palm trees, and through the bamboo brake, and across the plain of tree ferns. At last our destination lay in full sight of us. When we had crossed the second ridge, we saw before us an irregular, palm-studded plain, and then the line of high red cliffs which I have seen in the picture. There it lies, even as I write, and there can be no question that it is the same. At the nearest point, it is about 7 miles from our present camp, and it curves away, stretching as far as I can see. Challenger struts about like a prize peacock, and Summerlee is silent, but still skeptical. Another day should bring some of our doubts to an end. Meanwhile, as Jose, whose arm was pierced by a broken bamboo, insists upon returning, I send this letter back in his charge, and only hope that it may eventually come to hand. I will write again as the occasion serves. I have enclosed with this a rough chart of our journey, which may have the effect of making the account rather easier to understand. Chapter 9. Who could have foreseen it? A dreadful thing has happened to us. Who could have foreseen it? I cannot foresee any end to our troubles. It may be that we are condemned to spend our whole lives in this strange, inaccessible place. I am still so confused that I can hardly think clearly of the facts of the present or of the chances of the future. To my astounded senses, the one seems most terrible and the other as black as night. No men have ever found themselves in a worse position, nor is there any use in disclosing to you our exact geographical situation and asking our friends for a relief party. Even if they could send one, our fate will in all human probability be decided long before it could arrive in South America. We are, in truth, as far from any human aid as if we were in the moon. If we are to win through, it is only our own qualities which can save us. I have as companions 3 remarkable men of great brain power and of unshaken courage. There lies our one and only hope. It is only when I look upon the untroubled faces of my comrades that I see some glimmer through the darkness. Outwardly, I trust that I appear as unconcerned as they. Inwardly, I am filled with apprehension. Let me give you, with as much detail as I can, the sequence of events which have led us to this catastrophe. When I finished my last letter, I stated that we were within 7 miles from an enormous line of ruddy cliffs which encircled, beyond all doubt, the plateau of which Professor Challenger spoke. Their height as we approached them seemed to me in some places to be greater than he had stated, running up in parts to at least 1,000 feet, and they were curiously striated, in a manner which is, I believe, characteristic of basaltic upheavals. Something of the sort is to be seen in Salisbury Crags at Edinburgh. The summit showed every sign of a luxuriant vegetation, with bushes near the edge, and farther back many high trees. There was no indication of any life that we could see. That night we pitched our camp immediately under the cliff, a most wild and desolate spot. The crags above us were not merely perpendicular, but curved outwards at the top, so that ascent was out of the question. Close to us was the high thin pinnacle of rock which I believe I mentioned earlier in this narrative. It is like a broad red church mile, the top of it being level with the plateau, but a great chasm gaping between. On the summit of it there grew one high tree. Both pinnacle and cliff were comparatively low, some 500 or 600 feet, I should think. It was on that, said Professor Challenger, pointing to this tree, that the pterodactyl was perched. I climbed halfway up the rock before I shot him. I am inclined to think that a good mountaineer like myself could ascend the rock to the top, though he would, of course, be no nearer to the plateau when he had done so. As Challenger spoke of his pterodactyl, I glanced at Professor Summerlee, and for the first time I seemed to see some signs of a dawning credulity and repentance. There was no sneer upon his thin lips, but, on the contrary, a grey, drawn look of excitement and amazement. Challenger saw it too, and revelled in the first taste of victory. "Of course," said he, with his clumsy and ponderous sarcasm. "Professor Summerlee will understand that when I speak of a pterodactyl, I mean a stork, only it is the kind of stork which has no feathers, a leathery skin, membranous wings, and teeth in its jaws." He grinned and blinked and bowed until his colleague turned and walked away. In the morning, after a frugal breakfast of coffee and manioc, we had to be economical of our stores. We held a council of war as to the best method of ascending to the plateau above us. Challenger presided with a solemnity, as if he were the Lord Chief Justice on the bench. Picture him seated upon a rock, his absurd boyish straw hat tilted on the back of his head, his supercilious eyes dominating us from under his drooping lids, his great black beard wagging as he slowly defined our present situation and our future movements. Beneath him you might have seen the 3 of us, myself, sunburnt, young and vigorous after our open-air tramp, Summerlee, solemn but still critical, behind his eternal pipe, Lord John, as keen as a razor edge, with his supple, alert figure leaning upon his rifle, and his eager eyes fixed eagerly upon the speaker. Behind us were grouped the two swarthy half-breeds and the little knot of Indians, while in front and above us towered those huge, ruddy ribs of rocks which kept us from our goal. "I need not say," said our leader, "that on the occasion of my last visit I exhausted every means of climbing the cliff, and where I failed I do not think that anyone else is likely to succeed, for I am something of a mountaineer. I had none of the appliances of a rock climber with me, but I have taken the precaution to bring them now. With their aid, I am positive I could climb that detached pinnacle to the summit, but so long as the main cliff overhangs, it is vain to attempt ascending that. I was hurried upon my last visit by the approach of the rainy season and by the exhaustion of my supplies. These considerations limited my time, and I can only claim that I have surveyed about 6 miles of the cliff to the east of us, finding no possible way up. What, then, shall we now do?" "There seems to be only one reasonable course," said Professor Summerlee. "If you have explored the east, we should travel along the base of the cliff to the west and seek for a practicable point for our ascent." "That's it," said Lord John. "The odds are that this plateau is of no great size, and we shall travel round it until we either find an easy way up it or come back to the point from which we started." "I have already explained to our young friend here," said Challenger. He has a way of alluding to me as if I were a schoolchild 10 years old, "that it is quite impossible that there should be an easy way up anywhere, for the simple reason that, if there were, the summit would not be isolated, and those conditions would not obtain which have effected so singular an interference with the general laws of survival. Yet I admit that there may very well be places where an expert human climber may reach the summit, and yet a cumbrous and heavy animal be unable to descend. It is certain that there is a point where an ascent is possible." "How do you know that, sir?" asked Summerlee sharply. "Because my predecessor, the American Maplewhite, actually made such an ascent. How otherwise could he have seen the monster which he sketched in his notebook?" "There you reason somewhat ahead of the proved facts," said the stubborn Summerlee. "I admit your plateau, because I have seen it, but I have not as yet satisfied myself that it contains any form of life whatever." "What you admit, sir, or what you do not admit, is really of inconceivably small importance. I am glad to perceive that the plateau itself has actually obtruded itself upon your intelligence." He glanced up at it, and then, to our amazement, he sprang from his rock, and, seizing Summerlee by the neck, he tilted his face into the air. "Now, sir," he shouted, hoarse with excitement, "do I help you to realize that the plateau contains some animal life?" I have said that a thick fringe of green overhung the edge of the cliff. Out of this there had emerged a black, glistening object. As it came slowly forth and overhung the chasm, we saw that it was a very large snake with a peculiar flat, spade-like head. It wavered and quivered above us for a minute, the morning sun gleaming upon its sleek, sinuous coils. Then it slowly drew inwards and disappeared. Summerlee had been so interested that he had stood unresisting while Challenger tilted his head into the air. Now he shook his colleague off and came back to his dignity. "I should be glad, Professor Challenger," said he, "if you could see your way to make any remarks which may occur to you without seizing me by the chin. Even the appearance of a very ordinary rock python does not appear to justify such a liberty." "But there is life upon the plateau all the same," his colleague replied in triumph. "And now, Having demonstrated this important conclusion so that it is clear to anyone, however prejudiced or obtuse, I am of opinion that we cannot do better than break up our camp and travel to westward until we find some means of ascent. The ground at the foot of the cliff was rocky and broken, so that the going was slow and difficult, and suddenly we came, however, upon something which cheered our hearts. It was the site of an old encampment with several empty Chicago meat tins, a bottle labeled brandy, a broken tin opener, and a quantity of other travelers' debris. A crumpled, disintegrated newspaper revealed itself as the Chicago Democrat, though the date had been obliterated. "Not mine," said Challenger. "It must be Maple White's." Lord John had been gazing curiously at a great tree fern which overshadowed the encampment. "I say, look at this," said he. "I believe it is meant for a signpost." A slip of hardwood had been nailed to the tree in such a way as to point to the westward. "Most certainly a signpost," said Challenger. "What else? Finding himself upon a dangerous errand, our pioneer has left this sign so that any party which follows him may know the way he has taken. Perhaps we shall come upon some other indications as we proceed." We did indeed, but they were of a terrible and most unexpected nature. Immediately beneath the cliff there grew a considerable patch of high bamboo, like that which we had traversed in our journey. Many of these stems were 20 feet high, with sharp, strong tops, so that even as they stood, they made formidable spears. We were passing along the edge of this cover when my eye was caught by the gleam of something white within it. Thrusting in my head between the stems, I found myself gazing at a fleshless skull. The whole skeleton was there, but the skull had detached itself and lay some feet nearer to the open. With a few blows from the machetes of our Indians, we cleared the spot and were able to study the details of this old tragedy. Only a few shreds of clothes could still be distinguished, but there were the remains of boots upon the bony feet, and it was very clear that the dead man was a European. A gold watch by Hudson of New York and a chain which held a stylographic pen lay among the bones. There was also a silver cigarette case with J.C. from A.E.S. upon the lid. The state of the metal seemed to show that the catastrophe had occurred no great time before. "Who can he be?" asked Lord John. "Poor devil, every bone in his body seems to be broken." "And the bamboo grows through his smashed ribs," said Summerlee. "It is a fast-growing plant, but it is surely inconceivable that this body could have been here while the canes grew to be 20 feet in length." "As to the man's identity," said Professor Challenger, "I have no doubt whatever upon that point. As I made my way up the river, before I reached you at the fazenda, I instituted very particular inquiries about Maple White. At Para, they knew nothing. Fortunately, I had a definite clue, for there was a particular picture in his sketchbook which showed him taking lunch with a certain ecclesiastic at Rosario. This priest I was able to find, and though he proved a very argumentative fellow who took it absurdly amiss that I should point out to him the corrosive effect which modern science must have upon his beliefs, he nonetheless gave me some positive information. Maple White passed Rosario 4 years ago, or 2 years before I saw his dead body. He was not alone at the time, but there was a friend, an American named James Culver, who remained in the boat and did not meet this ecclesiastic. I think, therefore, that there can be no doubt that we are now looking upon the remains of this James Culver." "No," said Lord John. "Is there much doubt as to how he met his death? He has fallen or been chucked from the top, and so been impaled. How else could he come by his broken bones? And how could he have been stuck through by these canes with their points so high above our heads?" A hush came over us as we stood round these shattered remains and realized the truth of Lord John Roxton's words. The beetling head of the cliff projected over the canebrake. Undoubtedly, he had fallen from above. But had he fallen? Had it been an accident? Or already ominous and terrible possibilities began to form round that unknown land? We moved off in silence and continued to coast round the line of cliffs, which were as even and unbroken as some of those monstrous Antarctic ice fields which I have seen depicted as stretching from horizon to horizon and towering high above the mastheads of the exploring vessel. In 5 miles we saw no rift or break. And then suddenly we perceived something which filled us with new hope. In a hollow of the rock, protected from rain, there was drawn a rough arrow in chalk, pointing still to the westwards. "Maple White again," said Professor Challenger. He had some presentiment that worthy footsteps would follow close behind him. He had chalk, then. A box of coloured chalks was among the effects I found in his knapsack. I remember that the white one was worn to a stump. "That is certainly good evidence," said Summerlee. "We can only accept his guidance and follow on to the westward." We had proceeded some 5 more miles when again we saw a white arrow upon the rocks. It was at a point where the face of the cliff was for the first time split into a narrow cleft. Inside the cleft was a second guidance mark, which pointed right up it with the tip somewhat elevated, as if the spot indicated were above the level of the ground. It was a solemn place, for the walls were so gigantic and the slit of blue sky so narrow and so obscured by a double fringe of verdure that only a dim and shadowy light penetrated to the bottom. We had had no food for many hours and were very weary with the stony and irregular journey, but our nerves were too strung to allow us to halt. We ordered the camp to be pitched, however, and leaving the Indians to arrange it, we four, with the 2 half-breeds, proceeded up the narrow gorge. It was not more than 40 feet across at the mouth, but it rapidly closed until it ended in an acute angle. Too straight and smooth for an ascent. Certainly it was not this which our pioneer had attempted to indicate. We made our way back. The whole gorge was not more than 1/4 of a mile deep, and then suddenly the quick eyes of Lord John fell upon what we were seeking, high up above our heads, amid the dark shadows. There was one circle of deeper gloom. Surely it could only be the opening of a cave. The base of the cliff was heaped with loose stones at the spot, and it was not difficult to clamber up. When we reached it, all doubt was removed. Not only was it an opening into the rock, but on the side of it there was marked once again the sign of the arrow. Here was the point, and this the means by which Maple White and his ill-fated comrade had made their ascent. We were too excited to return to the camp, but must make our first exploration at once. Lord John had an electric torch in his knapsack, and this had to serve us as light. He advanced, throwing his little clear circlet of yellow radiance before him, while in single file we followed at his heels. The cave had evidently been water-worn, the sides being smooth and the floor covered with rounded stones. It was of such a size that a single man could just fit through by stooping. For 50 yards it ran almost straight into the rock, and then it ascended at an angle of 45. Presently, this incline became even steeper, and we found ourselves climbing upon hands and knees among loose rubble which slid from beneath us. Suddenly, an exclamation broke from Lord Roxton. "It's blocked," said he. Clustering behind him, we saw in the yellow field of light a wall of broken basalt which extended to the ceiling. "The roof has fallen in." In vain we dragged out some of the pieces. The only effect was that the larger ones became detached and threatened to roll down the gradient and crush us. It was evident that the obstacle was far beyond any efforts which we could make to remove it. The road by which Maple White had ascended was no longer available. With too much cast down to speak, we stumbled down the dark tunnel and made our way back to the camp. One incident occurred, however, before we left the gorge, which is of importance in view of what came afterwards. We had gathered in a little group at the bottom of the chasm, some 40 feet beneath the mouth of the cave, when a huge rock rolled suddenly downwards and shot past us with tremendous force. It was the narrowest escape for one or all of us. We could not ourselves see whence the rock had come, but our half-breed servants, who were still at the opening of the cave, said that it had flown past them, and must therefore have fallen from the summit. Looking upwards, we could see no sign of movement above us amidst the green jungle which topped the cliff. There could be little doubt, however, that the stone was aimed at us, so the incident surely pointed to humanity, and malevolent humanity, upon the plateau. We withdrew hurriedly from the chasm, our minds full of this new development and its bearing upon our plans. The situation was difficult enough before, but if the obstructions of nature were increased by the deliberate opposition of man, then our case was indeed a hopeless one. And yet, as we looked up at that beautiful fringe of verdure only a few hundreds of feet above our heads, there was not one of us who could conceive the idea of returning to London until we had explored it to its depths. On discussing the situation, we determined that our best course was to continue to coast round the plateau in the hope of finding some other means of reaching the top. The line of cliffs, which had decreased considerably in height, had already begun to trend from west to north, and if we could take this as representing the arc of a circle, the whole circumference could not be very great. At the worst, then we should be back in a few days at our starting point. We made a march that day which totaled some 22 miles, without any change in our prospects. I may mention that our aneroid shows us that, in the continual incline which we have ascended since we abandoned our canoes, we have risen to no less than 3,000 feet above sea level. Hence there is a considerable change both in the temperature and in the vegetation. We have shaken off some of that horrible insect life which is the bane of tropical travel. A few palms still survive, and many tree ferns, but the Amazonian trees have been all left behind. It was pleasant to see the convolvulus, the passion flower, and the begonia, all reminding me of home, here among these inhospitable rocks. There was a red begonia, just the same color as one that is kept in a pot in the window of a certain villa in Streatham, but I am drifting into private reminiscence. That night, I'm still speaking of the first day of our circumnavigation of the Plateau, a great experience awaited us, and one which forever set at rest any doubt which we could have had as to the wonders so near us. You will realize as you read it, my dear Mr. McArdle, and possibly for the first time, that the paper has not sent me on a wild goose chase, and that there is inconceivably fine copy waiting for the world whenever we have the professor's leave to make use of it. I shall not dare to publish these articles unless I can bring back my proofs to England, or I shall be hailed as the journalistic Munchausen of all time. I have no doubt that you feel the same way yourself, and that you would not care to stake the whole credit of the Gazette upon this adventure until we can meet the chorus of criticism and skepticism which such articles must of necessity elicit. So this wonderful incident, which would make such a headline for the old paper, must still wait its turn in the editorial drawer. And yet it was all over in a flash, and there was no sequel to it save in our own convictions. What occurred was this: Lord John had shot an agouti, which is a small, pig-like animal, and half of it having been given to the Indians. We were cooking the other half upon our fire. There is a chill in the air after dark, and we had all drawn close to the blaze. The night was moonless, but there were some stars bound, and one could see for a little distance across the plain. Well, suddenly out of the darkness, out of the night, there swooped something with a swish like an aeroplane. The whole group of us were covered for an instant by a canopy of leathery wings, and I had a momentary vision of a long snake-like neck, a fierce, red, greedy eye, and a great snapping beak, filled, to my amazement, with little, gleaming teeth. The next instant it was gone, and so was our dinner. A huge black shadow, 20 feet across, skimmed up into the air. For an instant the monster wings blotted out the stars, and then it vanished over the brow of the cliff above us. We all sat in amazed silence round the fire, like the heroes of Virgil when the harpies came down upon them. It was Summerlee who was the first to speak.
"Professor Challenger," said he, in a solemn voice, which quavered with emotion, "I owe you an apology, sir. I am very much in the wrong, and I beg that you will forget what is past." It was handsomely said, and the two men for the first time shook hands. So much we have gained by this clear vision of our first pterodactyl. It was worth a stolen supper to bring two such men together. But if prehistoric life existed upon the plateau, it was not superabundant, for we had no further glimpse of it during the next 3 days. During this time we traversed a barren and forbidding country, which alternated between stony desert and desolate marshes full of many wildfowl, upon the north and east of the cliffs. From that direction the place is really inaccessible, and were it not for a hardish ledge which runs at the very base of the precipice, we should have had to turn back. Many times we were up to our waists in the slime and blubber of an old semi-tropical swamp. To make matters worse, the place seemed to be a favorite breeding place of the Yarakaka snake, the most venomous and aggressive in South America. Again and again these horrible creatures came writhing and springing towards us across the surface of this putrid bog. And it was only by keeping our shotguns forever ready that we could feel safe from them.
One funnel-shaped depression in the morass, of a livid green in color from some lichen which festered in it, will always remain as a nightmare memory in my mind. It seems to have been a special nest of these vermins, and the slopes were alive with them, all writhing in our direction. For it is a peculiarity of the Yarakaka that he will always attack man at first sight. There were too many for us to shoot, so we fairly took to our heels and ran until we were exhausted. I shall always remember as we looked back how far behind we could see the heads and necks of our horrible pursuers rising and falling amid the reeds. Jarakaka Swamp, we named it in the map which we are constructing.
The cliffs upon the farther side had lost their ruddy tint, being chocolate brown in color. The vegetation was more scattered along the top of them, and they had sunk to 300 or 400 feet in height. But in no place did we find any point where they could be ascended. If anything, they were more impossible than at the first point where we had met them. Their absolute steepness is indicated in the photograph which I took over the stony desert. "Surely," said I, as we discussed the situation, "the rain must find its way down somehow. There are bound to be water channels in the rocks." "Our young friend has glimpses of lucidity," said Professor Challenger, patting me upon the shoulder. "The rain must go somewhere," I repeated. "He keeps a firm grip upon actuality. The only drawback is that we have conclusively proved by ocular demonstration that there are no water channels down the rocks." "Where then does it go?" I persisted. "I think it may be fairly assumed that if it does not come outwards, it must run inwards." "Then there is a lake in the center." "So I should suppose." "It is more than likely that the lake may be an old crater," said Summerlee. "The whole formation is, of course, highly volcanic, but, however that may be, I should expect to find the surface of the plateau slope inwards with a considerable sheet of water in the center, which may drain off by some subterranean channel into the marshes of the Jarakaka swamp. Or evaporation might preserve an equilibrium," remarked Challenger, and the two learned men wandered off into one of their usual scientific arguments, which were as comprehensible as Chinese to the layman. On the 6th day we completed our first circuit of the cliffs and found ourselves back at the first camp beside the isolated pinnacle of rock. We were a disconsolate party, for nothing could have been more minute than our investigation, and it was absolutely certain that there was no single point where the most active human being could possibly hope to scale the cliff. The place which Maplewhite's chalk marks had indicated as his own means of access was now entirely impassable. What were we to do now? Our stores of provisions, supplemented by our guns, were holding out well, but the day must come when they would need replenishment. In a couple of months the rains might be expected, and we should be washed out of our camp. The rock was harder than marble, and any attempt at cutting a path for so great a height was more than our time or resources would admit. No wonder that we looked gloomily at each other that night, and sought our blankets with hardly a word exchanged. I remember that, as I dropped off to sleep, my last recollection was that Challenger was squatting, like a monstrous bullfrog, by the fire, his huge head in his hands, sunk apparently in the deepest thought, and entirely oblivious to the good night which I wished him. But it was a very different Challenger who greeted us in the morning, a Challenger with contentment and self-congratulation shining from his whole person.
He faced us as we assembled for breakfast with a deprecating false modesty in his eyes, as who should say, "I know that I deserve all that you can say, but I pray you to spare my blushes by not saying it." His beard bristled exultantly. His chest was thrown out, and his hand was thrust into the front of his jacket. So, in his fancy, may he see himself sometimes, gracing the vacant pedestal in Trafalgar Square, and adding one more to the horrors of the London streets. "Eureka!" he cried, his teeth shining through his beard. "Gentlemen, you may congratulate me, and we may congratulate each other. The problem is solved." "You have found a way up?" "I venture to think so." "And where?" For answer, he pointed to the spire-like pinnacle upon our right. Our faces, or mine, at least, fell as we surveyed it. That it could be climbed we had our companion's assurance. But a horrible abyss lay between it and the plateau. "We can never get across," I gasped. "We can at least all reach the summit," said he. "When we are up, I may be able to show you that the resources of an inventive mind are not yet exhausted." After breakfast, we unpacked the bundle in which our leader had brought his climbing accessories. From it, he took a coil of the strongest and lightest rope, 150 feet in length, with climbing irons, clamps, and other devices. Lord John was an experienced mountaineer, and Summerlee had done some rough climbing at various times, so that I was really the novice at rock work of the party, but my strength and activity may have made up for my want of experience. It was not, in reality, a very stiff task, though there were moments which made my hair bristle upon my head. The first half was perfectly easy, but from there upwards it became continually steeper until, for the last 50 feet, we were literally clinging with our fingers and toes to tiny ledges and crevices in the rock. I could not have accomplished it, nor could Summerlee. If Challenger had not gained the summit, it was extraordinary to see such activity in so unwieldy a creature, and there fixed the rope round the trunk of the considerable tree which grew there. With this as our support, we were soon able to scramble up the jagged wall until we found ourselves upon the small grassy platform, some 25 feet each way, which formed the summit. The first impression which I received when I had recovered my breath was of the extraordinary view over the country which we had traversed. The whole Brazilian plain seemed to lie beneath us, extending away and away until it ended in dim blue mists upon the farthest skyline. In the foreground was the long slope, strewn with rocks and dotted with tree ferns, farther off in the middle distance. Looking over the Saddleback Hill, I could just see the yellow and green mass of bamboos through which we had passed, and then, gradually, the vegetation increased until it formed the huge forest which extended as far as the eyes could reach, and for a good 2,000 miles beyond. I was still drinking in this wonderful panorama when the heavy hand of the professor fell upon my shoulder. "This way, my young friend," said he, "vestigia nulla retrorsum. Never look rearwards, but always to our glorious goal." The level of the plateau, when I turned, was exactly that on which we stood, and the green bank of bushes, with occasional trees, was so near that it was difficult to realize how inaccessible it remained. At a rough guess, the gulf was 40 feet across, but so far as I could see, It might as well have been 40 miles. I placed one arm round the trunk of the tree and leaned over the abyss. Far down were the small dark figures of our servants, looking up at us. The wall was absolutely precipitous, as was that which faced me. "This is indeed curious," said the creaking voice of Professor Summerlee. I turned and found that he was examining with great interest the tree to which I clung. That smooth bark and those small ribbed leaves seemed familiar to my eyes. "Why," I cried, "it's a beech!" "Exactly," said Summerlee, "a fellow countryman in a far land." "Not only a fellow countryman, my good sir," said Challenger, "but also, if I may be allowed to enlarge your simile, an ally of the first value. This beech tree will be our saviour." "By George!" cried Lord John, "a bridge!" "Exactly, my friends. A bridge. It is not for nothing that I expended an hour last night in focusing my mind upon the situation. I have some recollection of once remarking to our young friend here that G.E.C. is at his best when his back is to the wall. Last night you will admit that all our backs were to the wall, but where willpower and intellect go together, there is always a way out. A drawbridge had to be found which could be dropped across the abyss. Behold it. It was certainly a brilliant idea. The tree was a good 60 feet in height, and if it only fell the right way it would easily cross the chasm. Challenger had slung the camp axe over his shoulder when he ascended. Now he handed it to me. "Our young friend has the thews and sinews," said he. "I think he will be the most useful at this task. I must beg, however, that you will kindly refrain from thinking for yourself, and that you will do exactly what you are told." Under his direction I cut such gashes in the sides of the trees as would ensure that it should fall as we desired. It had already a strong natural tilt in the direction of the plateau, so that the matter was not difficult. Finally I set to work in earnest upon the trunk, taking turn and turn with Lord John. In a little over an hour there was a loud crack. The tree swayed forward and then crashed over, burying its branches among the bushes on the farther side. The severed trunk rolled to the very edge of our platform, and for one terrible second we all thought it was over. It balanced itself, however, a few inches from the edge, and there was our bridge to the unknown. All of us, without a word, shook hands with Professor Challenger, who raised his straw hat and bowed deeply to each in turn. "I claim the honor," said he, "to be the first to cross to the unknown land, a fitting subject, no doubt, for some future historical painting." He had approached the bridge when Lord John laid his hand upon his coat. "My dear chap," said he, "I really cannot allow it." "Cannot allow it, sir!" The head went back and the beard forward. "When it is a matter of science, don't you know, I follow your lead because you are by way of being a man of science, but it's up to you to follow me when you come into my department." "Your department, sir?" "We all have our professions, and soldiering is mine. We are, according to my ideas, invading a new country, which may or may not be chock full of enemies of sorts. To barge blindly into it, for want of a little common sense and patience, isn't my notion of management." The remonstrance was too reasonable to be disregarded. Challenger tossed his head and shrugged his heavy shoulders. "Well, sir, what do you propose?" For all I know, there may be a tribe of cannibals waiting for lunchtime among those very bushes," said Lord John, looking across the bridge. "It's better to learn wisdom before you get into a cooking pot, so we will content ourselves with hoping that there is no trouble waiting for us, and at the same time we will act as if there were. Malone and I will go down again, therefore, and we will fetch up the 4 rifles, together with Gomez and the other. One man can then go across and the rest will cover him with guns until he sees that it is safe for the whole crowd to come along." Challenger sat down upon the cut stump and groaned his impatience, but Summerlee and I were of one mind that Lord John was our leader when such practical details were in question. The climb was a more simple thing now that the rope dangled down the face of the worst part of the ascent. Within an hour we had brought up the rifles and a shotgun. The half-breeds had ascended also, and under Lord John's orders they had carried up a bale of provisions in case our first exploration should be a long one. We had each bandoliers of cartridges. "Now, Challenger, if you really insist upon being the first man in," said Lord John, when every preparation was complete. "I am much indebted to you for your gracious permission," said the angry professor, "for never was a man so intolerant of every form of authority. Since you are good enough to allow it, I shall most certainly take it upon myself to act as pioneer upon this occasion." Seating himself with a leg overhanging the abyss on each side, and his hatchet slung upon his back, Challenger hopped his way across the trunk and was soon at the other side. He clambered up and waved his arms in the air. "At last," he cried, "at last!" I gazed anxiously at him with a vague expectation that some terrible fate would dart at him from the curtain of green behind him. But all was quiet, save that a strange, many-colored bird flew up from under his feet and vanished among the trees. Summerlee was the second. His wiry energy is wonderful in so frail a frame. He insisted upon having 2 rifles slung upon his back, so that both professors were armed when he had made his transit. I came next, and tried hard not to look down into the horrible gulf over which I was passing. Summerlee held out the butt end of his rifle, and an instant later I was able to grasp his hand. As to Lord John, he walked across, actually walked without support. He must have nerves of iron. And there we were, the 4 of us, upon the dreamland, the lost world of Maple White. To all of us it seemed the moment of our supreme triumph. Who could have guessed that it was the prelude to our supreme disaster? Let me say in a few words how the crushing blow fell upon us. We had turned away from the edge and had penetrated about 50 yards of close brushwood when there came a frightful rending crash from behind us. With one impulse we rushed back the way that we had come. The bridge was gone. Far down at the base of the cliff I saw, as I looked over, a tangled mass of branches and splintered trunk. It was our beech tree. Had the edge of the platform crumbled and let it through? For a moment this explanation was in all our minds. The next, from the farther side of the rocky pinnacle before us, a swarthy face, the face of Gomez the half-breed, was slowly protruded. Yes, it was Gomez, but no longer the Gomez of the demure smile and the mask-like expression. Here was a face with flashing eyes and distorted features, a face convulsed with hatred and with the mad joy of gratified revenge. "Lord Roxton!" he shouted. "Lord John Roxton!" "Well," said our companion, "here I am." A shriek of laughter came across the abyss. Yes, there you are, you English dog, and there you will remain. I have waited and waited, and now has come my chance. You found it hard to get up, you will find it harder to get down. You cursed fools, you are trapped, every one of you. We were too astounded to speak. We could only stand there staring in amazement. A great broken bough upon the grass showed whence he had gained his leverage to tilt over our bridge. The face had vanished, but presently it was up again, more frantic than before. "We nearly killed you with a stone at the cave," he cried. "But this is better. It is slower and more terrible. Your bones will whiten up there, and none will know where you lie or come to cover them. As you lie dying, think of Lopez, whom you shot 5 years ago on the Putumayo River. I am his brother and Thalm. Come what will, I will die happy now, for his memory has been avenged." A furious hand was shaken at us, and then all was quiet. Had the half-breed simply wrought his vengeance and then escaped, all might have been well with him. It was that foolish, irresistible Latin impulse to be dramatic which brought his own downfall. Roxton, the man who had earned himself the name of the Flail of the Lord through 3 countries, was not one who could be safely taunted. The half-breed was descending on the farther side of the pinnacle, but before he could reach the ground, Lord John had run along the edge of the plateau and gained a point from which he could see his man. There was a single crack of his rifle, and, though we saw nothing, we heard the scream and then the distant thud of the falling body. Roxton came back to us with a face of granite. "I have been a blind simpleton," said he, bitterly. "It's my folly that has brought you all into this trouble. I should have remembered that these people have long memories for blood feuds, and have been more upon my guard." "What about the other one? It took 2 of them to lever that tree over the edge." "I could have shot him, but I let him go. He may have had no part in it, but perhaps it would have been better if I had killed him, for he must, as you say, have lent a hand." Now that we had the clue to his action, each of us could cast back and remember some sinister act upon the part of the half-breed. His constant desire to know our plans, his arrest outside our tent when he was overhearing them, the furtive looks of hatred which from time to time one or other of us had surprised. We were still discussing it, endeavoring to adjust our minds to these new conditions, when a singular scene in the plain below arrested our attention. A man in white clothes, who could only be the surviving half-breed, was running as one does run when death is the pacemaker. Behind him, only a few yards in his rear, bounded the huge ebony figure of Zambo, our devoted Negro. Even as we looked, he sprang upon the back of the fugitive and flung his arms round his neck. They rolled on the ground together. An instant afterward Zambo rose, looked at the prostrate man, and then, waving his hand joyously to us, came running in our direction. The white figure lay motionless in the middle of the great plain. Our 2 traitors had been destroyed, but the mischief that they had done lived after them. By no possible means could we get back to the pinnacle. We had been natives of the world, now we were natives of the plateau. The 2 things were separate and apart. There was the plain which led to the canoes. Yonder, beyond the violet, hazy horizon, was the stream which led back to civilization. But the link between was missing. No human ingenuity could suggest a means of bridging the chasm which yawned between ourselves and our past lives. One instant had altered the whole conditions of our existence. It was at such a moment that I learned the stuff of which my three comrades were composed. They were grave, it is true, and thoughtful, but of an invincible serenity. For the moment we could only sit among the bushes in patience and wait the coming of Zambo. Presently his honest black face topped the rocks and his Herculean figure emerged upon the top of the pinnacle. "What I do now," he cried, "you tell me and I do it." It was a question which it was easier to ask than to answer. One thing only was clear. He was our one trusty link with the outside world. On no account must he leave us. "No, no," he cried, "I not leave you. Whatever come, you always find me here. But no able to keep Indians. Already they say too much Kurupuri live on this place, and they go home. Now you leave them me nor able to keep them." It was a fact that our Indians had shown in many ways of late that they were weary of their journey and anxious to return. We realized that Zambo spoke the truth, and that it would be impossible for him to keep them. "Make them wait till tomorrow, Zambo!" I shouted. "Then I can send letter back by them." "Very good, sir. I promise they wait till tomorrow," said the Negro. "But what I do for you now?" There was plenty for him to do, and admirably the faithful fellow did it. First of all, under our directions, he undid the rope from the tree stump and threw one end of it across to us. It was not thicker than a clothesline, but it was of great strength. And though we could not make a bridge of it, we might well find it invaluable if we had any climbing to do. He then fastened his end of the rope to the package of supplies which had been carried up, and we were able to drag it across. This gave us the means of life for at least a week, even if we found nothing else. Finally, he descended and carried up 2 other packets of mixed goods, a box of ammunition and a number of other things, all of which we got across by throwing our rope to him and hauling it back. It was evening when he at last climbed down, with a final assurance that he would keep the Indians till next morning. And so it is that I have spent nearly the whole of this, our first night upon the plateau, writing up our experiences by the light of a single candle lantern. We supped and camped at the very edge of the cliff, quenching our thirst with 2 bottles of Apollinaris, which were in one of the cases. It is vital to us to find water, but I think even Lord John himself had had adventures enough for one day, and none of us felt inclined to make the first push into the unknown. We forbore to light a fire or to make any unnecessary sound. Tomorrow, or today, rather, for it is already dawn as I write, we shall make our first venture into this strange land. When I shall be able to write again, or if I ever shall write again, I know not. Meanwhile, I can see that the Indians are still in their place, and I am sure that the faithful Zambo will be here presently to get my letter. I only trust that it will come to hand. P.S. The more I think, the more desperate does our position seem. I see no possible hope of our return. If there were a high tree near the edge of the plateau, we might drop a return bridge across. But there is none within 50 yards. Our united strength could not carry a trunk which would serve our purpose. The rope, of course, is far too short that we could descend by it. No, our position is hopeless, hopeless. Chapter 10. The most wonderful things have happened. The most wonderful things have happened and are continually happening to us. All the paper that I possess consists of 5 old notebooks and a lot of scraps, and I have only the one stylographic pencil, but so long as I can move my hand, I will continue to set down our experiences and impressions, for since we are the only men of the whole human race to see such things, it is of enormous importance that I should record them whilst they are fresh in my memory, and before that fate which seems to be constantly impending does actually overtake us. Whether Zambo can at last take these letters to the river, or whether I shall myself in some miraculous way carry them back with me, or, finally, whether some daring explorer, coming upon our tracks with the advantage, perhaps, of a perfected monoplane, should find this bundle of manuscript. In any case, I can see that what I am writing is destined to immortality as a classic of true adventure. On the morning after our being trapped upon the plateau by the villainous Gomez, we began a new stage in our experiences. The first incident in it was not such as to give me a very favorable opinion of the place to which we had wandered. As I roused myself from a short nap after day had dawned, my eyes fell upon a most singular appearance upon my own leg. My trouser had slipped up, exposing a few inches of my skin above my sock. On this there rested a large purplish grape. Astonished at the sight, I leaned forward to pick it off, when, to my horror, it burst between my finger and thumb, squirting blood in every direction. My cry of disgust had brought the 2 professors to my side. "Most interesting," said Summerlee, bending over my shin. "An enormous blood tick, as yet, I believe, unclassified." "The first fruits of our labours," said Challenger in his booming, pedantic fashion. "We cannot do less than call it Ixodes Maloni." "The very small inconvenience of being bitten, my young friend, cannot, I am sure, weigh with you as against the glorious privilege of having your name inscribed in the deathless roll of zoology. Unhappily you have crushed this fine specimen at the moment of satiation." "Filthy vermin," I cried. Professor Challenger raised his great eyebrows in protest, and placed a soothing paw upon my shoulder. "You should cultivate the scientific eye and the detached scientific mind," said he. "To a man of philosophic temperament like myself, the blood tick, with its lancet-like proboscis and its distending stomach, is as beautiful a work of nature as the peacock or, for that matter, the aurora borealis. It pains me to hear you speak of it in so unappreciative a fashion. No doubt, with due diligence, we can secure some other specimen." "There can be no doubt of that," said Summerlee grimly, "for one has just disappeared behind your shirt collar." Challenger sprang into the air bellowing like a bull and tore frantically at his coat and shirt to get them off. Summerlee and I laughed so that we could hardly help him. At last we exposed that monstrous torso, 54 inches, by the tailor's tape. His body was all matted with black hair, out of which jungle we picked the wandering tick before it had bitten him. But the bushes round were full of the horrible pests, and it was clear that we must shift our camp. But first of all it was necessary to make our arrangements with the faithful Negro, who appeared presently on the pinnacle with a number of tins of cocoa and biscuits, which he tossed over to us. Of the stores which remained below, he was ordered to retain as much as would keep him for 2 months. The Indians were to have the remainder as a reward for their services and as payment for taking our letters back to the Amazon. Some hours later, we saw them in single file far out upon the plain, each with a bundle on his head, making their way back along the path we had come. Zambo occupied our little tent at the base of the pinnacle, and there he remained, our one link with the world below. And now we had to decide upon our immediate movements. We shifted our position from among the tick-laden bushes until we came to a small clearing thickly surrounded by trees upon all sides. There were some flat slabs of rock in the center, with an excellent well close by. And there we sat in cleanly comfort while we made our first plans for the invasion of this new country. Birds were calling among the foliage, especially one with a peculiar whooping cry which was new to us. But beyond these sounds there were no signs of life. Our first care was to make some sort of list of our own stores, so that we might know what we had to rely upon, what with the things we had ourselves brought up and those which Zambo had sent across on the rope. We were fairly well supplied. Most important of all, in view of the dangers which might surround us, we had our 4 rifles and 1,300 rounds, also a shotgun, but not more than 150 medium pellet cartridges. In the matter of provisions, we had enough to last for several weeks, with a sufficiency of tobacco and a few scientific implements, including a large telescope and a good field glass. All these things we collected together in the clearing, and as a first precaution, we cut down with our hatchet and knives a number of thorny bushes, which we piled round in a circle some 15 yards in diameter. This was to be our headquarters for the time, our place of refuge against sudden danger, and the guardhouse for our stores. Fort Challenger, we called it. It was midday before we had made ourselves secure. But the heat was not oppressive, and the general character of the plateau, both in its temperature and in its vegetation, was almost temperate. The beech, the oak, and even the birch were to be found among the tangle of trees which girt us in. One huge ginkgo tree, topping all the others, shot its great limbs and maidenhair foliage over the fort which we had constructed. In its shade we continued our discussion, while Lord John, who had quickly taken command in the hour of action, gave us his views. "So long as neither man nor beast has seen or heard us, we are safe," said he. "From the time they know we are here, our troubles begin. There are no signs that they have found us out as yet, so our game surely is to lie low for a time and spy out the land. We want to have a good look at our neighbors before we get on visiting terms." "But we must advance," I ventured to remark. "By all means, Sonny, my boy, we will advance, but with common sense. We must never go so far that we can't get back to our base. Above all, we must never, unless it is life or death, fire off our guns." "But you fired yesterday," said Summerlee. "Well, it couldn't be helped. However, the wind was strong and blew outwards. It is not likely that the sound could have traveled far into the plateau. By the way, what shall we call this place? I suppose it is up to us to give it a name." But there were several suggestions more or less happy, but Challenger's was final. "It can only have one name," said he. "It is called after the pioneer who discovered it. It is Maple White Land." Maple White Land it became, and so it is named in that chart which has become my special task. So it will, I trust, appear in the atlas of the future. The peaceful penetration of Maple White Land was the pressing subject before us. We had the evidence of our own eyes that the place was inhabited by some unknown creatures. And there was that of Maple White's sketchbook to show that more dreadful and more dangerous monsters might still appear. That there might also prove to be human occupants, and that they were of a malevolent character was suggested by the skeleton impaled upon the bamboos, which could not have got there had it not been dropped from above. Our situation, stranded without possibility of escape in such a land, was clearly full of danger, and our reasons endorsed every measure of caution which Lord John's experience could suggest. Yet it was surely impossible that we should halt on the edge of this world of mystery when our very souls were tingling with impatience to push forward and to pluck the heart from it. We therefore blocked the entrance to our zareba by filling it up with several thorny bushes, and left our camp with the stores entirely surrounded by this protecting hedge. We then slowly and cautiously set forth into the unknown, following the course of the little stream which flowed from our spring, as it should always serve us as a guide on our return. Hardly had we started when we came across signs that there were indeed wonders awaiting us. After a few 100 yards of thick forest, containing many trees which were quite unknown to me, but which Summerlee, who was the botanist of the party, recognized as forms of conifera and of cycadaceous plants which have long passed away in the world below. We entered a region where the stream widened out and formed a considerable bog. High reeds of a peculiar type grew thickly before us, which were pronounced to be equisetaceae, or mare's tails, with tree ferns scattered amongst them, all of them swaying in a brisk wind. Suddenly Lord John, who was walking first, halted with uplifted hand. "Look at this," said he. "By George, this must be the trail of the father of all birds." An enormous three-toed track was imprinted in the soft mud before us. The creature, whatever it was, had crossed the swamp and had passed on into the forest. We all stopped to examine that monstrous spoor, if it were indeed a bird, and what animal could leave such a mark. Its foot was so much larger than an ostrich's that its height upon the same scale must be enormous. Lord John looked eagerly round him and slipped 2 cartridges into his elephant gun. "I'll stake my good name as a shikari," said he, "that the track is a fresh one. The creature has not passed 10 minutes. Look how the water is still oozing into that deeper print. By Jove, see, here is the mark of a little one." Sure enough, smaller tracks of the same general form were running parallel to the large ones. "But what do you make of this?" cried Professor Summerlee triumphantly, pointing to what looked like the huge print of a 5-fingered human hand appearing among the 3-toed marks. "Wealden!" cried Challenger in an ecstasy. "I've seen them in the Wealden clay. It is a creature walking erect upon 3-toed feet and occasionally putting one of its 5-fingered forepaws upon the ground. Not a bird, my dear Roxton, not a bird." "A beast?" "No, a reptile, a dinosaur. Nothing else could have left such a track. They puzzled a worthy Sussex doctor some 90 years ago, but who in the world could have hoped to have seen a sight like that?" His words died away into a whisper, and we all stood in motionless amazement. Following the tracks, we had left the morass and passed through a screen of brushwood and trees. Beyond was an open glade, and in this were 5 of the most extraordinary creatures that I have ever seen. Crouching down among the bushes, we observed them at our leisure. There were, as I say, 5 of them, 2 being adults and 3 young ones. In size they were enormous. Even the babies were as big as elephants, while the 2 large ones were far beyond all creatures I have ever seen. They had slate-colored skin, which was scaled like a lizard's and shimmered where the sun shone upon it. All 5 were sitting up, balancing themselves upon their broad, powerful tails and their huge 3-toed hind feet, while with their small 5-fingered front feet they pulled down the branches upon which they browsed. I do not know that I can bring their appearance home to you better than by saying that they looked like monstrous kangaroos, 20 feet in length, and with skins like black crocodiles. I do not know how long we stayed motionless, gazing at this marvelous spectacle. A strong wind blew towards us, and we were well concealed, so there was no chance of discovery. From time to time, the little ones played round their parents in unwieldy gambols, the great beasts bounding into the air and falling with dull thuds upon the earth. The strength of the parents seemed to be limitless, for one of them, having some difficulty in reaching a bunch of foliage which grew upon a considerable-sized tree, put his forelegs round the trunk and tore it down as if it had been a sapling. The action seemed, as I thought, to show not only the great development of its muscles, but also the small one of its brain, for the whole weight came crashing down upon the top of it, and it uttered a series of shrill yelps to show that, big as it was, there was a limit to what it could endure. The incident made it think, apparently, that the neighborhood was dangerous, for it slowly lurched off through the wood, followed by its mate and its 3 enormous infants. We saw the shimmering slaty gleam of their skins between the tree trunks, and their heads undulating high above the brushwood. Then they vanished from our sight. I looked at my comrades. Lord John was standing at gaze with his finger on the trigger of his elephant gun, his eager hunter's soul shining from his fierce eyes. What would he not give for one such head to place between the 2 crossed oars above the mantelpiece in his snuggery at the Albany? And yet his reason held him in. For all our exploration of the wonders of this unknown land depended upon our presence being concealed from its inhabitants. The 2 professors were in silent ecstasy. In their excitement they had unconsciously seized each other by the hand and stood like 2 little children in the presence of a marvel. Challenger's cheeks bunched up into a seraphic smile, and Summerlee's sardonic face softening for the moment into wonder and reverence.
"Nunc dimittis," he cried at last. "What will they say in England of this?" "My dear Summerlee, I will tell you with great confidence exactly what they will say in England," said Challenger. "They will say that you are an infernal liar and a scientific charlatan, exactly as you and others said of me. In the face of photographs. Faked, Summerlee, clumsily faked. In the face of specimens. There we may have them. Malone and his filthy Fleet Street crew may be all yelping our praises yet. August the 28th, the day we saw 5 live iguanodons in a glade of maple white land. Put it down in your diary, my young friend, and send it to your rag. And be ready to get the toe end of the editorial boot in return, said Lord John. Things look a bit different from the latitude of London, young fella, my lad. There's many a man who never tells his adventures, for he can't hope to be believed. Who's to blame them? For this will seem a bit of a dream to ourselves in a month or 2. What did you say they were? Iguanodons, said Summerlee.
You'll find their footmarks all over the Hastings sands, in Kent and in Sussex. The south of England was alive with them when there was plenty of good lush green stuff to keep them going. Conditions have changed, and the beasts died. Here it seems that the conditions have not changed, and the beasts have lived.
"If ever we get out of this alive, I must have a head with me," said Lord John. "Lord, how some of that Somaliland-Uganda crowd would turn a beautiful pea green if they saw it. I don't know what you chaps think, but it strikes me that we are on mighty thin ice all this time." I had the same feeling of mystery and danger around us. In the gloom of the trees there seemed a constant menace, and as we looked up into their shadowy foliage, vague terrors crept into one's heart. It is true that these monstrous creatures which we had seen were lumbering, inoffensive brutes which were unlikely to hurt anyone. But in this world of wonders, what other survivals might there not be? What fierce, active horrors ready to pounce upon us from their lair among the rocks or brushwood? I knew little of prehistoric life, but I had a clear remembrance of one book which I had read, in which it spoke of creatures who would live upon our lions and tigers as a cat lives upon mice. What if these also were to be found in the woods of Maple Whiteland? It was destined that on this very morning, our first in the new country, we were to find out what strange hazards lay around us. It was a loathsome adventure, and one of which I hate to think. If, as Lord John said, the glade of the iguanodons will remain with us as a dream, then surely the swamp of the pterodactyls will forever be our nightmare. Let me set down exactly what occurred. We passed very slowly through the woods, partly because Lord Roxton acted as scout before he would let us advance, and partly because at every second step one or other of our professors would fall, with a cry of wonder, before some flower or insect which presented him with a new type. We may have travelled 2 or 3 miles in all, keeping to the right of the line of the stream, when we came upon a considerable opening in the trees. A belt of brushwood led up to a tangle of rocks. The whole plateau was strewn with boulders. We were walking slowly towards these rocks, among bushes which reached over our waists, when we became aware of a strange, low, gabbling and whistling sound, which filled the air with a constant clamour and appeared to come from some spot immediately before us. Lord John held up his hand as a signal for us to stop, and he made his way swiftly, stooping and running, to the line of rocks. We saw him peep over them and give a gesture of amazement. Then he stood staring as if forgetting us. So utterly entranced was he by what he saw. Finally, he waved us to come on, holding up his hand as a signal for caution. His whole bearing made me feel that something wonderful but dangerous lay before us. Creeping to his side, we looked over the rocks. The place into which we gazed was a pit, and may, in the early days, have been one of the smaller volcanic blowholes of the Plateau. It was bowl-shaped, and at the bottom, some hundreds of yards from where we lay, were pools of green scummed, stagnant water, fringed with bulrushes. It was a weird place in itself, but its occupants made it seem like a scene from the 7 Circles of Dante. The place was a rookery of pterodactyls. There were hundreds of them congregated within view. All the bottom area round the water edge was alive with their young ones, and with hideous mothers brooding upon their leathery, yellowish eggs. From this crawling, flapping mass of obscene reptilian life came the shocking clamour which filled the air and the mephitic, horrible, musty odor which turned us sick. But above, perched each upon its own stone, tall, grey and withered, more like dead and dried specimens than actual living creatures, sat the horrible males, absolutely motionless save for the rolling of their red eyes or an occasional snap of their rat-trap beaks as a dragonfly went past them. Their huge, membranous wings were closed by folding their forearms, so that they sat like gigantic old women, wrapped in hideous web-colored shawls, and with their ferocious heads protruding above them, large and small. Not less than 1,000 of these filthy creatures lay in the hollow before us. Our professors would gladly have stayed there all day, so entranced were they by this opportunity of studying the life of a prehistoric age. They pointed out the fish and dead birds lying about among the rocks as proving the nature of the food of these creatures, and I heard them congratulating each other on having cleared up the point why the bones of this flying dragon are found in such great numbers in certain well-defined areas, as in the Cambridge greensand, since it was now seen that, like penguins, they lived in gregarious fashion. Finally, however, Challenger, bent upon proving some point which Summerlee had contested, thrust his head over the rock and nearly brought destruction upon us all. In an instant the nearest male gave a shrill, whistling cry and flapped its 20-foot span of leathery wings as it soared up into the air. The females and young ones huddled together beside the water, while the whole circle of sentinels rose one after the other and sailed off into the sky. It was a wonderful sight to see at least 100 creatures of such enormous size and hideous appearance, all swooping like swallows with swift, shearing wing strokes above us. But soon we realized that it was not one on which we could afford to linger. At first the great brutes flew round in a huge ring, as if to make sure what the exact extent of the danger might be. Then the flight grew lower and the circle narrower, until they were whizzing round and round us, the dry, rustling flap of their huge slate-colored wings filling the air with a volume of sound that made me think of Hendon Aerodrome upon a race day. "Make for the wood and keep together," cried Lord John, clubbing his rifle. "The brutes mean mischief." The moment we attempted to retreat, the circle closed in upon us, until the tips of the wings of those nearest to us nearly touched our faces. We beat at them with the stocks of our guns, but there was nothing solid or vulnerable to strike. Then suddenly, out of the whizzing, slate-colored circle, a long neck shot out, and a fierce beak made a thrust at us. Another and another followed. Summerlee gave a cry and put his hand to his face, from which the blood was streaming. I felt a prod at the back of my neck, and turned dizzy with the shock. Challenger fell, and as I stooped to pick him up, I was again struck from behind and dropped on the top of him. At the same instant I heard the crash of Lord John's elephant gun, and, looking up, saw one of the creatures with a broken wing struggling upon the ground, spitting and gurgling at us with a wide-open beak and bloodshot, goggled eyes, like some devil in a medieval picture. Its comrades had flown higher at the sudden sound, and were circling above our heads. "Now," cried Lord John, "now for our lives." We staggered through the brushwood, and even as we reached the trees, the harpies were on us again. Summerlee was knocked down, but we tore him up and rushed among the trunks. Once there we were safe, for those huge wings had no space for their sweep beneath the branches.
as we limped homewards, sadly mauled and discomfited. We saw them for a long time, flying at a great height against the deep blue sky above our heads, soaring round and round, no bigger than wood pigeons, with their eyes no doubt still following our progress. At last, however, as we reached the thicker woods, they gave up the chase and we saw them no more. "A most interesting and convincing experience," said Challenger, as we halted beside the brook and he bathed a swollen knee. "We are exceptionally well informed, Summerlee, as to the habits of the enraged pterodactyl." Summerlee was wiping the blood from a cut in his forehead while I was tying up a nasty stab in the muscle of the neck. Lord John had the shoulder of his coat torn away, but the creature's teeth had only grazed the flesh. "It is worth noting," Challenger continued, "that our young friend has received an undoubted stab, while Lord John's coat could only have been torn by a bite. In my own case, I was beaten about the head by their wings, so we have had a remarkable exhibition of their various methods of offense." "It has been touch and go for our lives," said Lord John, gravely, "and I could not think of a more rotten sort of death than to be outed by such filthy vermin. I was sorry to fire my rifle, but by Jove, there was no great choice." "We should not be here if you hadn't," said I, with conviction. "It may do no harm," said he. "Among these woods there must be many loud cracks from splitting or falling trees which would be just like the sound of a gun. But now, if you are of my opinion, we have had thrills enough for one day, and had best get back to the surgical box at the camp for some carbolic. Who knows what venom these beasts may have in their hideous jaws? But surely no men ever had just such a day since the world began. Some fresh surprise was ever in store for us. When, following the course of our brook, we at last reached our glade and saw the thorny barricade of our camp, we thought that our adventures were at an end. But we had something more to think of before we could rest. The gate of Fort Challenger had been untouched, the walls were unbroken, and yet it had been visited by some strange and powerful creature in our absence. No footmark showed a trace of its nature, and only the overhanging branch of the enormous ginkgo tree suggested how it might have come and gone. But of its malevolent strength there was ample evidence in the condition of our stores. They were strewn at random all over the ground, and one tin of meat had been crushed into pieces so as to extract the contents. A case of cartridges had been shattered into matchwood, and one of the brass shells lay shredded into pieces beside it. Again, the feeling of vague horror came upon our souls, and we gazed round with frightened eyes at the dark shadows which lay around us, in all of which some fearsome shape might be lurking. How good it was when we were hailed by the voice of Zambo, and, going to the edge of the plateau, saw him sitting grinning at us upon the top of the opposite pinnacle. "All well, Massa Challenger, all well," he cried. "Me stay here, no fear. You always find me when you want." His honest black face, and the immense view before us, which carried us halfway back to the affluent of the Amazon, helped us to remember that we really were upon this earth in the 20th century, and had not by some magic been conveyed to some raw planet in its earliest and wildest state. How difficult it was to realize that the violet line upon the far horizon was well advanced to that great river upon which huge steamers ran, and folk talked of the small affairs of life, while we, marooned among the creatures of a bygone age, could but gaze towards it and yearn for all that it meant. One other memory remains with me of this wonderful day, and with it I will close this letter. The two professors, their tempers aggravated, no doubt, by their injuries, had fallen out as to whether our assailants were of the genus Pterodactylus or Dimorphodon, and high words had ensued. To avoid their wrangling, I moved some little way apart, and was seated smoking upon the trunk of a fallen tree, when Lord John strolled over in my direction. "I say, Malone," said he, "do you remember that place where those beasts were?" "Very clearly." "A sort of volcanic pit, was it not?" "Exactly," said I. "Did you notice the soil?" "Rocks." "But round the water, where the reeds were?" "It was a bluish soil, it looked like clay." "Exactly, a volcanic tube full of blue clay?" "What of that?" I asked. "Oh, nothing, nothing," said he, and strolled back to where the voices of the contending men of science rose in a prolonged duet, the high, strident note of Summerlee rising and falling to the sonorous bass of Challenger. I should have thought no more of Lord John's remark, were it not that once again that night I heard him mutter to himself, "Blue clay, clay in a volcanic tube." They were the last words I heard before I dropped into an exhausted sleep. Die Begegnung mit dem Megalosaurus hat gezeigt, dass in dieser prähistorischen Welt ständige Gefahr lauert. Lord John Roxton bewies dabei unglaublichen Mut und rettete womöglich das Leben seiner Gefährten. Doch die Erkenntnis, dass solch furchterregende Kreaturen hier leben, ändert die Dynamik der Expedition grundlegend. Werden sie ihre Mission erfüllen und Beweise sammeln können, oder werden sie selbst zu Gejagten in dieser verlorenen Welt? Bleibt dran!